The weight of centuries pressed down upon the ancient stones of the Tower of London, a palpable force that greeted every visitor. But for the man with the worn leather satchel and a skeptic's determined stride, it was merely atmosphere. He was a journalist, drawn not by the crown jewels or the history of kings, but by the whispers that clung to the ramparts like ivy, the stories of headless apparitions and spectral weeping that no official guidebook would ever print. His notebook was filled with questions, his digital recorder a shield against the superstition he intended to dissect. He spent the afternoon as a shadow amongst the tourists, his true purpose hidden behind a polite smile as he interviewed the yeoman warders. Their uniforms were a splash of vibrant color against the grey stone, but their stories were monochrome tales of grief. One, a man with a veteran's weary eyes, spoke of a headless form drifting near the scaffold site, a chill preceding its silent passage. Another described the sound of weeping, a woman's desolate sobs that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the White Tower, a sound that had driven more than one night guard to request a transfer. The journalist took meticulous notes, his pen scratching a counterpoint to their somber tones, cataloguing the phenomena with a clinical detachment. He attributed the accounts to overactive imaginations, to the power of suggestion in a place so steeped in tales of betrayal and execution. As the sun began its descent, bleeding orange and purple across the Thames, the crowds thinned and the great gates creaked shut. The daytime murmur of visitors faded, replaced by a profound and heavy silence. It was then that the first prickle of unease traced a cold finger down his spine. The air in the inner ward grew still, too still, as if the very dust motes dancing in the fading light were holding their breath. He stood alone in the courtyard, the imposing facades of the Bloody Tower and the Wakefield Tower. Looming over him, their windows like sightless eyes, a sensation of being watched intensely and unblinkingly settled over him. He turned, his rational mind scrambling for an explanation. A lingering raven, a watchful CCTV camera, but found nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, an unseen presence keeping pace with his every step, a silent companion in the gathering dusk. It was this sensation, this undeniable and irrational chill, that solidified his resolve. The story needed more than second-hand accounts. It needed proof, or the definitive lack of it. He had secured special permission for an overnight stay, a privilege granted on the condition of discretion. His destination was the Bloody Tower, a place synonymous with the mysterious disappearance of the two young princes. The name alone was enough to conjure ghosts, but he entered with his recorder held before him like a talisman. The room inside was smaller than he had imagined, the low ceiling and thick walls creating a claustrophobic intimacy. He set up his equipment with practiced efficiency, a high-sensitivity microphone on the cold stone hearth, a night vision camera on a tripod aimed at the doorway, and an EMF meter on the windowsill. The soft glow of the device's LEDs cast eerie, shifting shadows on the ancient walls. As full darkness claimed the tower, he sat in a worn wooden chair, the only sounds the hum of his electronics and the frantic, hopeful beating of his own heart. The investigation had truly begun, and the stones of the tower, having witnessed centuries of secrets, seemed to be waiting with him. The night deepened, wrapping the tower in a silence so absolute it felt like a physical substance, thick and heavy in the air. The journalist's vigil in the Bloody Tower stretched into the dead hours, the initial thrill of investigation giving way to a monotonous creeping fatigue. His eyelids grew heavy, the hum of the recording equipment a lulling drone. Just as his head began to nod, a sharp, metallic crackle erupted from the speaker connected to the remote microphone he had placed near Traitor's Gate. He jolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Leaning closer, he strained to listen, his breath held tight in his chest. Through the static a voice emerged, thin, reedy, and laced with a desperation that was utterly alien. It was not a word, but a sound, a drawn-out, guttural exhalation of pure anguish that seemed to bleed from the very stones of the river entrance. He checked the EMF meter. Its needle was dancing erratically, spiking into the red zone despite there being no conceivable source of such energy in the ancient, dormant fortress. Driven by a compulsion he could not name, he rose on unsteady legs, leaving the relative safety of the chamber. The courtyard was a cavern of shadows, the moon a sliver of bone behind scudding clouds. A low, river-borne mist coiled around his ankles as he moved silently towards the water gate. The air grew colder with every step, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the weather. And then he saw it. A figure stood before the closed portcullis of Traitor's Gate, a tall, indistinct shape silhouetted against the dark water. It was clad in the unmistakable silhouette of Tudor dress, a doublet and hose that seemed woven from the shadows themselves. There was no face, only a deeper darkness beneath a feathered cap, but he felt its attention fix upon him, a weight of centuries-old sorrow and fury. Every rational instinct screamed at him to flee, to retreat to the modern world of facts and explanations that waited beyond the walls. But the journalist in him, the part that sought the undeniable truth, pushed him forward. He took a step, then another, his recorder held out, a futile shield against the impossible. He was close enough now to see the finer details, the intricate slashings on the sleeves of the doublet that were not fabric but shreds of solidified gloom. A profound sense of dread, a cold, sinking. Certainty of his own insignificance in the face of this timeless grief washed over him. He opened his mouth, a question about identity or purpose forming on his lips, but no sound emerged. The figure did not fade or dissolve. One moment it was there, a solid, palpable presence radiating cold misery, and the next it was simply gone. Not a retreat, but an erasure, as if it had never been. The oppressive cold vanished with it, leaving the journalist shivering in the mild night air. The EMF meter in his pocket fell silent, its reading dropping to 0. He stood alone, the only proof the frantic, terrified pounding of his own heart and the digital file on his recorder. He knew with a certainty that settled deep into his bones that he had his story. He had captured the ghost in sound and witnessed it in form. But he also knew, as he packed his equipment with trembling hands and fled the tower at first light, that this was a story that could never be published. It was a truth too raw, too personal, and too terrifying. It was a secret the tower had entrusted to him, and to break that trust would be to invite the cold and the shadow back into his life forever. The wind that swept up the Royal Mile carried with it the ghosts of 1,000 years, a mournful chorus that seemed to whisper from the very cobblestones. High upon its volcanic perch, Edinburgh Castle was not merely a fortress of stone and history, but a monument to the restless dead, its silhouette a jagged cutout against a sky the colour of bruised slate. A small tour group huddled near the portcullis gate, their faces upturned as their guide. A man with a voice as weathered as the castle ramparts began his tales. He spoke not just of kings and queens, but of the ones who never left, the phantoms woven into the fabric of the place. His star attraction was the phantom piper, a boy who had ventured into the tunnels beneath the castle to map their depths, his brave skirl of bagpipes echoing until it faded into an eternal silence, a lonely tune still heard on the deepest, darkest nights. He spoke too of the lost souls, prisoners of war and forgotten servants, whose spectral forms were sometimes glimpsed in the barracks, or felt as a sudden, sorrowful presence in a quiet corridor. Among the group was a woman named Clara, a structural engineer whose world was built on concrete facts and measurable forces. She listened to the guide's stories with a polite, detached smile, her mind deconstructing the legends into simple geology and psychology. Drafts explained by wind tunnels through ancient masonry, and apparitions born of suggestion in a highly charged atmosphere. As the tour moved into the dank, oppressive heart of the castle's dungeons, her skepticism remained a solid, comfortable shield. The air grew thick and cold, smelling of wet earth and centuries of despair. The guide's voice dropped to a reverent hush as he described the prisoners from the wars of independence who had been left to rot in the pitch-black pits, their names lost to time, but their anguish imprinted on the stone. It was then, as she stood at the entrance to one of the deeper sealed oubliettes, that Clara's rational fortress was breached. A wave of cold so intense it felt like a physical blow slammed into her, a frigid pocket of air that had no business existing in the stagnant atmosphere. It coiled around her, seeping through her jacket and sweater, chilling her skin and raising the fine hairs on her arms. It was a cold that felt ancient and intelligent, a cold that carried with it the faint, metallic taste of fear and the phantom scent of unwashed bodies and rotting straw. She took a sharp, involuntary step back, her heart giving a single, hard thump against her ribs. The feeling lasted only a moment before dissipating, leaving her shivering and unnerved. She glanced around, but the other tourists seemed unaffected, merely listening with rapt attention. She brushed it off, attributing it to a sudden draft, a trick of the mind in the macabre setting. Yet, a seed of disquiet had been planted. Later, as the tour concluded near St. Margaret's Chapel and the group began to disperse under a darkening afternoon sky, Clara lingered, wanting to reclaim her sense of equilibrium. She stood looking out over the city, the familiar spires and rooftops a testament to the living modern world below. And then she heard it, faint at first, a distant, reedy drone that grew steadily clearer. It was the unmistakable sound of bagpipes, a lonely, mournful pibroch that seemed to be playing just for her. The tune was slow, haunting, a lament that spoke of lost causes and eternal solitude. She turned, expecting to see a piper performing for the remaining visitors, perhaps near the Great Hall. But the esplanade was nearly empty, the last of the tourists filing towards the exit. The music grew louder, swirling around her on the wind, yet there was no piper to be seen. The skirl was coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, a phantom performance echoing from the very stones of the battlements. The sound climbed to a piercing, sorrowful peak before fading away into the growing twilight, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more profound and terrifying than the music itself. Clara stood frozen, her earlier chill returning tenfold, her scientific certainty crumbling into dust. The castle was not just old stone, it was alive with memory, and it had just sung her its most tragic song. Logic was a fortress Clara had spent a lifetime building, its walls high and its foundations sunk deep into the bedrock of empirical evidence. But the phantom skirl of bagpipes and the dungeon's inexplicable chill had struck that fortress like a siege engine, leaving hairline fractures in her certainty. That night, sleep proved impossible, the mournful melody replaying in her mind on a loop. By the pale pre-dawn light, a new stubborn resolve had crystallized. She would return to the castle alone. Not as a credulous tourist, but as an investigator, armed with a rationalist's toolkit, to reclaim the territory her own senses had betrayed. She would find the draft source, identify the hidden speaker, and prove that the castle's ghosts were nothing more than atmospheric quirks and clever stories. The castle grounds in the misty grey quiet of early morning were a different world from the bustling tourist attraction of the day before. The stone walls, slick with condensation, seemed to absorb the weak light, casting the courtyards and passageways into deep, brooding shadow. Her footsteps echoed with a hollow, lonely sound as she made her way directly back to the dungeons, bypassing the grand halls and royal apartments for the prison that had unnerved her. The air was still and tomb-like, the only sound the distant, muted traffic from the city below. She moved with purpose, her flashlight beam cutting a swathe through the gloom, searching for ventilation shafts, gaps in the masonry, any logical explanation for the pocket of supernatural cold. She found nothing. The stonework was solid, the air unmoving. Frustration began to prickle at her, a hot counterpoint to the creeping dread that was slowly seeping back into her bones. It was then, as she stood in the very spot where the cold had gripped her, that the temperature plummeted. This was not a draft, it was an invasion. The air grew so frigid her breath plumed in thick, white clouds, and the metal of her flashlight became almost painful to hold. The beam of her light flickered, then died, plunging her into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight on her eyes. From that consuming blackness, a figure began to coalesce. It did not walk into view, but simply manifested, a patch of deeper shadow pulling itself into the gaunt, ragged shape of a man. He was emaciated, his clothes little more than rotten rags hanging from a skeletal frame. His face was a mask of grime and despair, his eyes hollow sockets that held a universe of suffering. This was no generic spook. This was a specific, terrible soul, a prisoner from the wars of independence, his agony preserved in the spiritual record of the stone. Clara stood paralyzed, her mind screaming denials that her eyes could not obey. The spectre did not advance. Instead, it raised a translucent, bony hand, and the dungeon walls fell away. Suddenly, she was not just seeing him, she was with him. Visions flooded her mind, not as images, but as raw, immersive experience. She felt the gnawing hunger in her own belly, the ache of bones pressed against cold, damp stone. She heard the ragged, hopeless breathing of other men in the pitch-black oubliette, the soft, mad whimpers that were the only language left to them. She felt the crushing weight of years of imprisonment, the slow, excruciating erosion of hope, the final desperate surrender to a forgotten death. The ghost's entire tragic existence, his capture, his loss, his slow dissolution, was downloaded into her consciousness in a single, overwhelming torrent of shared despair. A scream tore from Clara's throat, a raw, primal sound of terror and empathy that shattered the oppressive silence. The connection broke. The visions vanished. The flashlights sputtered back to life, revealing an empty, silent dungeon. The crushing cold was gone, but the memory of it, and the phantom sensations of starvation and confinement, were seared into her nerves. Her disbelief, that fortress of a lifetime, lay in ruins, shattered not by a trick of the light, but by the undeniable, brutal truth of another's pain. She did not walk, but fled, stumbling up the stairs and through the courtyards, her rational world left behind in the darkness. She burst out onto the esplanade, gasping in the clean, cold morning air, forever changed, her skepticism replaced by the terrifying knowledge that some stones do not just remember history, they weep it. The ghost of a queen is a powerful lure, a siren song of tragedy that draws the curious to the places where history curdles into legend. For the Miller family, a day trip to Hampton Court Palace was meant to be a harmless immersion into Tudor grandeur, a chance for the children to run through vast gardens while the parents admired the tapestries. Yet, from the moment they passed through the great gatehouse, the story of Catherine Howard, the young wife who had run screaming down a gallery begging a king who would not listen for her life, hung over the sun-drenched bricks like a fine, persistent mist. It was a tale of terror and betrayal that had captivated Sarah Miller, a history teacher who found the human element of the past far more compelling than dates and treaties. Her husband, Mark, was more pragmatic, humoring her interest, but seeing only architecture and landscaping, the solid, tangible remains of a bygone era. The sprawling palace, with its mullioned windows and ornate chimneys, seemed to breathe with two different lungs. One was the vibrant public face of opulent staterooms and manicured courtyards. The other was a quieter, more secretive presence, a whisper in the long galleries and a chill in the shadowy corridors. After a brief tour of the opulent king's apartments, the family split by unspoken agreement. The two children, Lily and Ben, their imaginations fired by stories of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, begged to explore the famous maze and the sprawling gardens that stretched down to the Thames. Eager for the freedom of open space, they raced ahead, their laughter echoing off the warm stone, a sound of pure, unburdened life. Sarah and Mark, however, found themselves drawn deeper into the palace's interior, towards the infamous haunted gallery. It was Sarah's idea, a pilgrimage to the site of Catherine's final desperate plea. As they left the bustling main thoroughfares, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The air grew still and heavy, the sounds of other visitors fading into a muffled distance. The gallery itself was a long, narrow passage of dark wood and portraits of stern-faced Tudors, their painted eyes seeming to follow their progress. The late afternoon light, filtering through the leaded windows, lay in dusty, stagnant bars across the floorboards. Almost immediately, Mark felt it. A subtle but distinct pressure began to build in his temples, a feeling of being watched that was so intense it was almost a physical touch on the back of his neck. He shook his head, blaming the stuffy air and the low ceiling. But the sensation only grew. Sarah, too, fell silent, her historical curiosity giving way to a creeping unease. Then a sudden, inexplicable draught snaked through the utterly still corridor, a cold finger of air that stirred the hem of her coat and lifted the hairs on her arms. It was a cold that felt unnatural, carrying with it a scent of old stone and something faintly floral, like long-dead roses. They exchanged a glance, a silent communication of shared disquiet. Mark reached for Sarah's hand, his pragmatic certainty beginning to fray at the edges. As they walked slowly down the gallery, the whispers began. Not words, but the ghost of sound, a susurration that seemed to come from just behind the heavy tapestries or from the other end of the long hall. It was the sound of frantic, feminine pleading, a desperate, breathless murmur that was swallowed by the silence almost as soon as it was heard. It was a sound that matched the story perfectly, the echo of a queen's terror trapped in the timber and plaster. They stopped walking, standing frozen in the center of the gallery. The oppressive presence was now a tangible force, a weight of sorrow and panic that pressed in from all sides, making the air difficult to breathe. The vibrant sunlit world of their children playing in the gardens felt a million miles away. They were no longer tourists observing history. They had become unwilling participants in a tragedy that refused to end, guests in a gallery where the past was not past at all, but a living, breathing, and deeply distressed entity. That night, in the unfamiliar quiet of a hotel room just a stone's throw from the palace walls, Sarah Miller fell into a fitful sleep. The oppressive atmosphere of the haunted gallery clung to her subconscious, twisting her dreams into a frantic, panicked tapestry. She was no longer herself, but a young woman, her heart a wild, trapped bird beating against her ribs. Heavy, embroidered skirts tangled around her legs as she ran, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The halls of Hampton Court stretched before her, an endless maze of dark wood and cold stone, the portraits on the walls blurring into a gallery of accusing, merciless faces. She was running for her life, her slippers whispering against the polished floorboards, the sound of heavy booted footsteps echoing behind her, growing ever closer. A name, her name, Catherine, echoed in the cavernous space, not a call but a condemnation. The dream ended with a final desperate lunge towards a distant locked door, her own scream trapped in her throat. Sarah awoke with a jolt, the phantom sensation of running still trembling in her limbs. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed 3:17 a.m. The room was pitch black and unnaturally cold, a deep, seeping chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. She lay perfectly still, her husband Mark breathing deeply and steadily beside her, oblivious. The dream's terror was receding, but a new, more profound fear was taking its place, the fear of the waking world confirming the nightmare. And then she smelled it. A faint, elusive fragrance of perfume, a blend of rose and something spicier, like cloves or myrrh. It was a scent utterly alien to her, to the hotel, a ghost of a fragrance that hung in the frigid air for a few heartbeats before fading away, leaving only the sterile smell of conditioned air in its wake. She did not wake Mark. Instead, she lay there in the consuming darkness, the pieces, clicking into place with a dreadful, inevitable certainty. The oppressive presence in the gallery, the phantom whispers, the inexplicable cold draught. It was not their imagination, nor was it simply the power of suggestion in a historic setting. Catherine Howard's spirit had not been a story in a guidebook. She had been a presence, a raw nerve of terror and betrayal that had reached out across the centuries. Their visit to her gallery had been an intrusion, an unwitting disturbance of a soul trapped in its most agonizing moment. The dream had not been her own, but an echo, a desperate communication from a queen who was still, eternally, running for her life. The chill slowly dissipated, but the memory of it, and the faint, ghostly scent of perfume, lingered in the room like a confession. Sarah finally understood. They had not gone to Hampton Court to observe a haunting. They had been invited into one. The experience had left an indelible mark, a subtle shift in the family's perception of the world. The next morning, over a quiet breakfast, the children chattered about the maze and the great vine in the greenhouse, their world still bright and solid. Mark spoke of the architecture, but his eyes, when they met Sarah's, held a new, unspoken wariness. They were a family united, but they were also a family haunted, not by a visible spectre, but by the profound and unsettling knowledge that the past was not always content to stay buried. The ghost of a queen had brushed against their lives, and the cold of that contact was something that would never fully leave them. There are secrets that architecture cannot help but tell, truths whispered in the cant of a wall, the odd thickness of a foundation, the inexplicable dead space between one room and the next. For Alistair Finch, an architect with a historian's soul and a draftsman's eye for detail, these silent confessions were a language more compelling than any ghost story. He had come to Glamis Castle not for its legends of a hidden, monstrous air, but for its bones, the blueprints and the stonework that hinted at a deeper, more tangible mystery woven into its very structure. The great Scottish baronial pile, with its turrets and towers spearing a low grey sky, was a puzzle box of stone, and he was determined to find its hidden compartments. His days were spent in the castle's private archives, a dusty, parchment-scented room where the air was thick with the weight of forgotten years. He pored over centuries-old architectural plans, his fingers tracing lines drawn by long-dead hands. The official records told one story, a straightforward progression of halls and chambers, but it was the anomalies that set his heart racing. A wall on the 1,792 plans was 6 inches thicker than its counterpart in 1680. A staircase in the east wing seemed, according to the angles, to leave a void behind it, a space unaccounted for in any room above or below. These were the ghosts he sought, not spectres of flesh and blood, but phantoms of intention, the deliberate lies told by blueprints to conceal something the family had never wanted found. The legend of the monster of Glamis, a deformed child hidden away from the world, was a tragic folktale, but these hidden passages and sealed rooms were its potential physical proof, a skeleton key to a very real, very human secret. One afternoon, armed with a modern floor plan annotated with his own suspicions, he gained permission to explore a disused section of the servants' quarters, a warren of low-ceilinged rooms and narrow corridors deep in the castle's belly. The air here was cold and still, smelling of old wood and disuse. His flashlight beam danced over rough stone walls, illuminating cobwebs that hung like tattered lace. He was searching for the telltale seam of a concealed door, the slight irregularity in the masonry that would betray the presence of one of his theoretical passages. He ran his hands over the cold stone, feeling for a draft, a change in temperature, anything that would confirm his calculations. It was then that he heard it. A soft, rhythmic scratching, like the sound of a dog wanting to be let in, or of fingernails dragging slowly, patiently, across ancient timber. It was faint, seeming to come from the other side of the wall he was examining. He froze, his breath misting in the cold air, and listened. The sound was not random, it had a pattern, a slow, persistent scrape, pause, scrape, pause. It was a sound of presence, of something trapped or waiting. A logical part of his mind suggested rats, a colony nesting within the castle's immense walls. But the sound was too deliberate, too focused. It felt intelligent. As the scratching continued, a new sensation began to creep over him, a feeling so potent it was almost a taste at the back of his throat. It was a sense of being watched, not with curiosity, but with a deep, simmering malevolence. The air grew heavier, the darkness in the corners of the corridor seeming to thicken and congeal. The temperature dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds, the cold seeping through the soles of his shoes and climbing his spine. This was not the passive chill of a stone building. This was an active, hostile cold, a warning. The scratching sound seemed to sharpen, becoming more insistent, as if whatever was making it knew he was there, listening, intruding. Alistair stood motionless in the gloom, his architectural certainty dissolving into a primal fear. He was no longer just a man studying a building. He was an uninvited guest in a place that guarded its secrets with a jealous, living fury, and he was suddenly, terrifyingly aware that he was not alone. The scratching ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence that was somehow more menacing than the sound itself. Alistair remained frozen, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, the architect's mind now fully subsumed by the prey animal's instinct. The malevolent presence he felt was a tangible force, a pressure in the air that seemed to push against him, warning him away from the cold, damp stones of the corridor. But the same stubborn curiosity that had drawn him to the castle's hidden geometries now overrode his fear. The secret was here, just beyond this wall. He had to know. Ignoring the icy dread pooling in his stomach, he turned his attention back to the stonework, his movements slow and deliberate. His flashlight beam, now trembling slightly in his grip, scanned the mortar joints. And there it was, not a crack, but a perfection so slight it was an imperfection. A vertical seam, almost invisible, where the mortar was a fraction smoother and darker than the surrounding work. It was a craftsman's secret, a concealed door made to look like part of the wall. He pressed his palm against the cold stone, and with a soft, grating sigh that sounded like a long-held breath being released, a section of the wall swung inward. A wave of stale, dust-laden air billowed out, carrying with it the faint sweet and sour scent of decayed wood and old fabric. He stepped through the opening into a space the blueprints had vehemently denied existed. The room was small, little more than a cell, sealed away from light and time. His flashlight beam cut through the profound darkness, illuminating a scene of poignant, heartbreaking stillness. A thick, grey blanket of dust lay over everything, softening edges and muting colors. In the center of the room stood a small, canopied bed, its hangings moth-eaten and brittle with age. The bed was neatly made, as if waiting for a sleeper who had merely stepped out for a moment, but who had never returned. On the floor beside it sat a collection of toys, a carved wooden soldier, its paint faded, a hobby horse with a matted mane, a small stack of leather-bound books. They were the artifacts of a childhood, but a childhood that had been entombed within these walls. And then he saw the occupant. Sitting on the edge of the dusty bed was a small, pale figure. It was not solid, but composed of a faint, shimmering luminescence, like moonlight filtering through mist. It was the shape of a young boy, his form indistinct, his head slightly bowed. There was no monstrous deformity, no hint of the legend that had swirled around this hidden air for generations. There was only a profound and endless sadness, an aura of loneliness so absolute it made the air in the room ache. The ghost did not look at him, did not move. It simply was, a perpetual monument to a life denied, a soul forever bound to the place of its imprisonment. In that silent, dusty room, Alistair Finch understood everything. The hidden passages, the altered blueprints, the family shame. It had not been about concealing a monster, but about hiding a tragedy. A child, perhaps disfigured by illness or simple birth, had been deemed unfit for the world, his existence erased from the family record, and his life confined to this secret chamber. The malevolent presence he had felt in the corridor was not the boy's, but the castle's own protective fury, the accumulated grief and guilt of generations standing sentinel over this terrible secret. The scratching he had heard was not a threat, but the sound of a lonely spirit eternally trying to reach a world from which it had been exiled. A deep, solemn respect settled over him, quieting his fear. He took a slow step back, his eyes never leaving the silent, sorrowful figure. He knew with a certainty that went beyond professional ethics that this was a truth that was not his to reveal. To expose this room would be to violate a sacred trust, to disturb a peace that was as fragile as the dust on the toys. He carefully pulled the concealed door shut, the stone grating back into place with a final, soft thud, sealing the ghost and its tragedy back into the darkness. The secret of Glamis was safe with him. He would record nothing, speak of it to no one. Some truths were not meant for blueprints or history books. They were burdens to be carried silently, out of respect for the lost and the sorrows that walls, as well as people, are built to hold. There is a particular quality to a place deemed the most haunted, a heavy, expectant silence that seems to swallow sound and light, a reputation that hangs over the crumbling bricks and sagging timbers like a shroud. Borley Rectory did not disappoint. Standing isolated amidst the flat, misty Essex countryside, the Victorian building was a study in neglect, its gabled roof a jagged silhouette against a leaden sky, its many windows boarded up like blind eyes. To the man unloading equipment from his van, it was not a home but a laboratory, the ultimate test subject. He was a paranormal investigator, a man who traded in the cold, hard currency of data, his faith placed in sensors and cameras, in electromagnetic field meters and digital voice recorders. Ghosts, to him, were not phantoms of folklore, but patterns of energy, residual imprints, intelligences that could be measured, catalogued, and understood. He crossed the overgrown garden, the wet grass soaking his trousers, the key to the rectory cold and heavy in his hand. The stories were legion, a cacophony of supernatural claims, phantom coaches rattling up the drive, a mournful nun glimpsed in the twilight, bells that rang with no one to pull the cords, and the persistent violent fury of a poltergeist. He knew them all, but he gave them no credence. Anecdotes were the currency of the gullible. His currency was empirical evidence. The lock turned with a rusty screech that echoed unnaturally in the quiet, and the heavy oak door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a breath of air that was thick with the smell of damp plaster, rotting wood, and the profound musty chill of abandonment. Inside, the gloom was absolute, a physical presence that his high-powered flashlight could only push back, not defeat. The beam revealed a scene of beautiful decay, peeling. Wallpaper hung in limp curls, revealing the lath and plaster beneath like exposed ribs. The floorboards were warped and dusty, scattered with the debris of collapsed ceilings and the nests of long-departed animals. He moved through the ground floor with a methodical purpose, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, empty rooms, the drawing room, the study, the kitchen. In each space he set up his equipment with the quiet reverence of a priest preparing an altar. Tripods were unfolded, cameras mounted and angled to cover the widest possible field of view. Infrared sensors were positioned in doorways, ready to log any movement in the dark. He placed EMF meters on mantelpieces and windowsills, their silent screens waiting to spike with unseen energy. Microphones, sensitive enough to hear a spider walk, were placed in the center of rooms to capture any anomaly in the acoustic environment. His base of operations was the old dining room, a cavernous space where a long table, thick with dust, still stood as a ghost of past gatherings. Here, he set up his monitoring station, linking the various cameras and sensors to a bank of laptops, their screens casting a cool blue glow onto his intent face. As dusk began to bleed into night, sealing the rectory in utter blackness beyond his small island of light, he began his vigil. The initial hours were a study in silence, the only sounds the hum of his computers and the frantic skittering of something in the walls. He checked his readings, noting nothing but baseline environmental data. Then, a little after midnight, it began. It started in the kitchen, a room he had left empty. A sharp, metallic clatter erupted from the speaker connected to that microphone, the sound of a pot or pan being flung across the stone floor. On the corresponding laptop screen, the infrared camera showed nothing but an empty room. A moment later, from the hallway upstairs, the distinct heavy tread of footsteps sounded, not the furtive scuttle of an animal, but the solid, purposeful footfalls of a man walking with a measured pace. The motion sensor in the hallway triggered, its light blinking on his console, yet the camera feed showed the corridor was deserted. He watched, his breath held, as a small porcelain figurine that had been sitting undisturbed on the dining room mantelpiece for decades suddenly trembled, then slid off the edge, shattering into 100 dusty pieces on the hearth. There was no draft, no vibration, no physical cause he could discern. The rectory was coming alive, objects were moving, footsteps were pacing through empty halls, and his equipment was faithfully recording it all. A slow smile spread across his face, not of fear, but of triumph. This was not anecdote, this was data. This was the poltergeist activity, the phantom phenomena, captured in real time. The most haunted house in England was proving its title, and he was there, a silent witness, collecting its ghostly confessions. One shattered piece of pottery, one echoing footstep at a time. The initial thrill of capturing the rectory's poltergeist activity soon gave way to a more profound and unsettling realization. The phenomena were not random. The footsteps paced a specific route, from the top of the main staircase to the end of the first-floor landing, over and over, a path worn by repetition. The objects that moved were often those associated with domestic life: kitchenware, a discarded hairbrush, a single candlestick, as if someone, or something, was reenacting the mundane rituals of a home that no longer existed. The investigator's scientific detachment began to fray at the edges. He was not just recording chaotic energy, he was observing a pattern, an intelligence. The house was not merely haunted, it was occupied. Driven by this new understanding, he decided to attempt communication. He set up a spirit box, a device that rapidly scanned through radio frequencies, creating a cascade of white noise and fragmented audio from which entities were said to form words. The resulting cacophony was jarring in the profound silence of the dining room, a storm of static and disembodied voices from 1,000 forgotten broadcasts. He held the device before him. Its red led a single, unblinking eye in the gloom. He asked simple, direct questions into the chilling air, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Is there anyone here with us?" The radio static hissed and spat, a meaningless barrage of sound. Then, a single clear word sliced through the noise, a woman's voice, soft and laced with an ancient sorrow. "Here." A current of ice water seemed to flow through his veins. He pressed on, his questions becoming more specific, guided by the rectory's most famous legend. "Who are you?" The static surged, then parted again. "A sister." The voice was frail, a whisper spun from memory and regret. "Why do you remain?" This time, the answer did not come as a single word, but as a torrent of impressions that flooded his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. He saw, felt, understood a story of forbidden love. A young nun from a nearby convent, her vows a cage for a passionate heart, and a wealthy layman from the Borley estate. Secret meetings in the moonlit gardens, whispered promises, the terrifying, exhilarating risk of their affair. Then, the inevitable discovery, the fury, the plans for a desperate elopement. But there was no happy escape, only a cold, brutal end. A vision of a struggle by the old well, a push, a cry swallowed by the night, and the terrible final silence as a body was hidden, a life and a love erased by murder. The spirit box shrieked, the voice of the nun becoming a ragged, broken thing. He promised. He promised. The grief emanating from the unseen presence was a physical force, a weight of centuries-old heartbreak that pressed the air from the room. The investigator sat transfixed, his equipment forgotten, his rational world dissolving in the face of this raw, communicated tragedy. He had come for data and had found a confession. The sorrow did not last. As if the act of reliving its murder had unleashed a long-contained fury, the atmosphere in the room twisted. The profound sadness curdled into something hot, sharp, and violently angry. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the moisture in the air crystallized, a fine mist of ice particles swirling in the beam of his flashlight. The spirit box exploded in a shower of plastic and wires, not from a power surge, but as if crushed by an invisible fist. Across the room, his bank of laptops flickered and died simultaneously, their screens going black. The tripods holding his cameras were violently wrenched sideways, the expensive equipment smashing against the walls and floor with the sound of shattering glass and buckling metal. The EMF meters screamed a continuous deafening alarm before their screens cracked and went dark. A force, unseen and immense, slammed into his chest, throwing him backward out of his chair. He landed hard on the dusty floorboards, the wind knocked from his lungs. The very walls of the rectory seemed to groan, and from the darkness above, a deep, guttural roar of pure rage echoed through the empty halls, a sound that held no humanity, only a bottomless, destructive hate. The intelligent presence was gone, replaced by a storm of poltergeist fury that was now directed squarely at him. Scrambling on his hands and knees, gasping for air, he did not look back. He abandoned his destroyed equipment, his notes, his proof. He fled the dining room, stumbling through the pitch-black corridors, the sound of splintering wood and crashing debris following him like a predator. He burst out of the front door into the cold night air, not stopping until he reached his van. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and sped away from Borley Rectory, leaving the nuns' sorrow and the rectory's rage behind him. His search for empirical evidence ended by the terrifying, undeniable truth of a love that had turned to murder, and a ghost that had finally been pushed too far. Some places are not merely haunted, they are built upon foundations of suffering, their very mortar mixed with blood and ancient fear. The ancient Ram Inn was such a place, a crooked skeleton of timber and wattle and daub that slumped into the Gloucestershire earth as if ashamed of its own history. To the young couple who pulled their car into the weed-choked gravel lot, it was the ultimate thrill, a dare made real. They had sought out the reputedly most haunted inn in England, not for a peaceful getaway, but for a brush with the supernatural, a story to tell at parties. Leo, with his camera ever at the ready, saw it a photo essay in the making. Maya, more sensitive and prone to intuition, felt a tremor of apprehension the moment the inn's sagging roofline came into view, a primal warning she quickly buried under a veneer of excited bravado. The innkeeper was a man who seemed carved from the same gnarled oak as his property, his eyes holding a weary knowledge of the things his guests came to find. He welcomed them into a low-ceilinged parlour, where the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and centuries of damp. As he handed over a heavy iron key, his words were not of comfortable beds or a full English breakfast, but a quiet, solemn briefing. He spoke of the land upon which the inn was built, a site sacred to pagan tribes long before the first stone was laid. He told them of ley lines converging beneath the floorboards, of ancient rituals performed to appease the old gods, and of the darker practices that sometimes accompanied the whisper of sacrifices, both animal and human, offered to the soil to ensure fertility or victory. The inn, he explained, was not just a building with ghosts, it was a spiritual sinkhole, a place where the veil between worlds had been worn thin by millennia of concentrated belief and bloodshed. Their room was up a steep, treacherously sloping staircase that groaned with every step. It was the bishop's room, named for a previous spectral resident, and it felt less like a bedroom and more like a forgotten reliquary. The ceiling was oppressively low, the massive blackened oak beams seeming to press down upon them. The single small window, its glass warped and bubbled, looked out onto a tangled, gloomy churchyard. A four-poster bed, its hangings heavy with dust, dominated the space, its mattress sighing like a dying thing when Leo dropped their bag onto it. The atmosphere was heavy, stale, and carried a faint coppery tang, like old pennies or dried blood. As dusk surrendered to a deep, moonless night, the initial thrill began to curdle into a pervasive unease. The single, weak bulb in the room flickered intermittently, casting jittering, elongated shadows that danced across the uneven walls. These were not the passive shadows cast by moving headlights. These were shapes that seemed to detach themselves from the corners, shifting and slinking along the paneling of their own volition. Leo tried to laugh it off, blaming faulty wiring, but his laughter sounded hollow and forced in the dense silence. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself, unable to shake the feeling that they were not just being watched, but being studied by something old and utterly alien. Then the laughter began. It was faint at first, a distant melodic sound that seemed to filter up through the floorboards. It was the unmistakable, carefree laughter of children at play. For a moment, it was almost charming, a ghostly echo of innocent joy. But the charm quickly soured. The laughter did not fade with distance. It grew closer, circling the room, seeming to come from the hallway one moment, from the empty fireplace the next. It was a sound without a source, a chorus of unseen presences running through the walls. The joyful tones began to twist, taking on a mocking, almost cruel edge, the giggles becoming sharp and brittle. It was the sound of children who had been playing for centuries, their game long since stripped of any true happiness, leaving only the hollow, repetitive shell of the sound itself. Leo stood frozen, his camera forgotten in his hand. Maya pulled the dusty bedspread up to her chin, her eyes wide, staring into the shifting darkness where the shadows writhed and the phantom children laughed, their cheerful echoes now the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. They had come for a thrill, and the ancient pagan soil of the inn was all too happy to oblige. Sleep, when it finally came for Maya, was a thin and fragile thing, a shallow pool of unconsciousness easily disturbed by the currents flowing through the ancient room. The phantom children's laughter had eventually faded, not into silence, but into a watchful, predatory stillness that was somehow worse. The darkness in the bishop's room was no longer merely an absence of light. It was a conscious entity, a thick, sentient blackness that pressed in on all sides, heavy with the weight of forgotten prayers and spilled blood. She drifted in this uneasy state, her mind tethered to the waking world by a single taut thread of fear. It was a change in pressure that pulled her fully awake, a sudden denseness in the air that made her ears pop. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the deep gloom. The embers in the small fireplace had died hours ago, and the only light was a faint, sickly greyness seeping through the warped windowpane. For a moment, she saw nothing but the familiar, oppressive shapes of the room. Then her gaze drifted to the foot of the vast four-poster bed. A figure stood there. It was a silhouette of absolute blackness, a man-shaped void that seemed to drink the faint light from the room, making the surrounding shadows appear pale by comparison. It had no discernible features, no face, no clothing, only a humanoid outline that radiated a cold so intense it felt like a physical force, stealing the warmth from her blood and the breath from her lungs. It was tall, its head nearly brushing the low, crooked beam of the ceiling, and it was perfectly, terribly still. The pagan history of the place, the tales of sacrifice whispered by the innkeeper, crystallized in that single horrifying moment. This was no playful child spirit or sorrowful nun. This was something primal, a guardian of the old, blood-soaked earth, and they were trespassers in its sacred space. Maya lay paralyzed, a silent scream trapped in her constricted throat. Her mind screamed for Leo, but her body was frozen, locked in a primal state of terror. The figure did not move, but its presence was an active aggression, a violation of the very air. Then, with a speed that was utterly unnatural, it lunged. It did not step or lean. One instant it was a statue of darkness at the foot of the bed. The next it was a blur of malevolent intent hurtling directly toward her. There was no sound, no rush of air, only the terrifying, instantaneous closing of that impossible distance. The void where its face should have yawned before her, a gateway into an abyss of pure, ancient hatred. The scream that finally tore from her was not a conscious act, but a raw, reflexive explosion of terror that shattered the suffocating silence. It was a sound that belonged not to the modern world, but to the same primal fear that had once echoed on this land during pagan rites. The force of it seemed to jolt the very room. Leo erupted from his sleep beside her, disoriented and panicked. "What? What is it?" he yelled, fumbling for the lamp on the bedside table. The light, when it came, was a weak, yellow pool that did little to push back the oppressive gloom, but it was enough. The space at the foot of the bed was empty. The crushing cold was already receding, fleeing from the electric light like a vampire from the dawn. Maya was sobbing, trembling uncontrollably, her finger pointing a shaky accusation. At the empty space, Leo scrambled out of bed, his heart hammering, and wrapped his arms around her. It was then that his eyes fell upon the wall behind the bed's headboard, the wall that had been in shadow. 3 long, deep gouges were scored into the ancient wood paneling, as if claws of immense strength had raked down its surface. The splinters were fresh and pale, standing out starkly against the dark, aged oak. They were too high, too violently etched to be the work of any animal or the result of decay. They were a mark, a territorial claim, a warning carved into the very fabric of the inn. They did not speak. There were no words adequate for what had happened. In a frantic, synchronized rush, they threw their belongings into their bag, their movements jerky and fueled by pure adrenaline. They did not look back as they fled the room, stumbling down the groaning staircase and out into the cold, blessedly normal air of the pre-dawn. They threw the key onto the front desk and scrambled into their car, the engine roaring to life. As they sped away from the crooked silhouette of the ancient Ram Inn, the first rays of the sun were painting the horizon. But for Maya and Leo, the memory of the lunging shadow and the fresh, savage claw marks on the wall would forever be their sun, a permanent internal darkness born from a single night in a place that had shown them a terror far older and far more real than any thrill they had ever sought. Some landscapes are not just shaped by geology, but by memory. They absorb the stories of those who have lived, suffered, and died upon their slopes, holding the echoes of the past in the curve of a hill or the whisper of the wind through the heather. Pendle Hill was such a place, a brooding, whale-backed giant rising from the Lancashire moorland, its summit often shrouded in cloud like a secret too terrible to be fully seen. For Ilara, a seasoned hiker with a historian's curiosity, the climb was a pilgrimage. Her backpack was filled with trail mix and water, but her mind was filled with the names of the Pendle witches, Demdike, Chattocks and the others, poor, marginalized women whose lives had ended in the noose and the fire, their supposed confessions extracted under the shadow of this very hill. She did not believe in their magic, but she believed fiercely in their tragedy, and she had come to walk in their footsteps, to feel the weight of the history that clung to the thin, cold air. The day was bright but brittle, the autumn sun a pale, cold coin in a vast cerulean sky. The path began gently, cutting through fields where sheep grazed, their bleating a mundane counterpoint to the dark thoughts in her head. But as she ascended, the landscape began to change, the green pastures giving way to coarse brown moor grass and stretches of dark peaty soil that sucked at her boots. The wind, which had been a gentle companion below, now picked up, keening across the open hillside with a lonely, persistent voice. It was easy, in such a place, to understand how superstition could take root. The hill itself felt watchful, its vast, silent presence a judgment on the world below. She was about halfway up, pausing to catch her breath and take a long drink from her water bottle, when she noticed an old man standing a little way off the path, leaning on a gnarled wooden staff. He seemed as much a part of the landscape as the weathered stone walls that crisscrossed the lower slopes, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his clothes the color of the earth. He had not been there a moment before, or so it seemed. He nodded to her, his eyes, a startlingly clear blue in his weathered face, holding an unnerving intensity. "Aye, it's a grand day for it," he said, his voice a dry rustle like dead leaves. "But you'll be wanting to mind yourself, lass. This isn't just a hill." Ilara, used to the friendly warnings of locals, smiled politely. "I've read about the witches. It's a sad history." The old man's gaze didn't waver. "History?" He gave a short, humorless bark of a laugh. "It's not history up here. It's now. The ground remembers. They cursed the ones that sent them to the gallows. They cursed the judges. They cursed the very earth that bore witness. And a curse, once spoken, doesn't just fade away. It soaks into the soil. It waits." He pointed a crooked finger towards the summit, still hidden from view. "They don't take kindly to strangers, not up top, not after what was done. You feel the air change, you see the mist come down. You turn back, you hear me, you turn back." With that he turned and began to walk away, not back down the path, but across the treacherous tussocky moorland, moving with an impossible goat-like surety until he was swallowed by the contours of the hill. Ilara was left alone, the old man's words hanging in the air like a chill. She shook her head, dismissing it as the ramblings of an old man steeped in local legend, but a seed of unease had been planted. The bright sun suddenly felt weak, the vast sky oppressive. She continued her climb, but the joy had gone out of it. The wind's keen now sounded less like a natural force and more like a lament. The landscape, once starkly beautiful, now seemed hostile, the dark peat hags looking like open wounds in the flesh of the hill. And then, as if summoned by the old man's warning, the weather began to turn. A bank of thick grey fog, white and dense as wool, began to boil up from the valleys on the far side of the hill. It moved with an unnatural speed, flowing over the summit and spilling down the slopes towards her, swallowing the light and the distance in a silent, inexorable tide. Within minutes, the world had shrunk to a radius of a few feet. The path vanished. The wind was muted. The only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart and the soft, wet crunch of her boots on the turf. She stopped, disoriented, a cold dread seeping through her layers of clothing. She was about to heed the old man's warning and turn back when a movement in the fog caught her eye. She squinted, her breath catching in her throat. Up ahead, near the crest of the hill, the mist swirled and parted for a moment. Silhouetted against the blank, white void were figures. Not solid, walking figures, but dark, static shapes, perhaps a dozen of them, standing in a loose circle. They were tall and indistinct, their forms seeming to ripple at the edges. They were looking down, looking at her. A profound and ancient malice radiated from them, a cold collective gaze that pinned her to the spot. The old man's words echoed in her mind. They don't take kindly to strangers. The silhouettes did not move, but their attention was a physical weight, a promise of something terrible waiting in the blinding, featureless white. The hill was no longer a monument to a sad history. It was a prison for a fury that had never died, and she was an intruder in its yard. The fog was a prison, its damp, white walls closing in, severing Ilara from the world of maps and marked trails. The silhouettes on the hilltop had vanished back into the swirling murk, but their malevolent gaze seemed to linger, a psychic stain on the air. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She turned, stumbling back the way she thought she had come, but the landscape was a featureless void. Every tussock of grass looked the same, every patch of dark peat a potential chasm. The wind had died completely, leaving a silence so profound she could hear the blood pulsing in her ears. She was utterly lost, a modern woman adrift in a sea of ancient, vengeful memory. Her boots slipped on the wet turf, sending a scatter of stones skittering into the nothingness. She fell to her knees, the impact jarring up through her bones. As she pushed herself up, her hand brushed against something cold and unyielding, something that was not earth or grass. It was stone, worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. Her breath hitched. She crawled forward, her fingers tracing a perfect curved arc emerging from the ground, then another and another. She was in the center of a circle, a ring of standing stones that no map had ever recorded, hidden on this lonely shoulder of the hill. They were not grand like Stonehenge, but low and secretive, their surfaces pitted with age, seeming to absorb the weak light that filtered through the fog. This was a place of power, old and deep, a church built before the concept of God had ever reached these shores, and she was not alone. The mist at the edges of the circle began to thicken and coalesce, pulling itself into forms that were almost human. They were women, their figures woven from the very fabric of the fog and the hill's shadow, translucent and shimmering. They wore the rough, simple clothes of 17th century peasants, their faces gaunt and etched with hardship, their eyes burning with a cold, phosphorescent light. They did not look at each other, but their attention was fixed on a single point in the center of the circle, a space that held a terrible shared focus. This was the coven, the spectral gathering of the Pendle witches, forever bound to the site of their final desperate rites. Ilara crouched behind one of the larger stones, her body trembling uncontrollably. She was not seeing a reenactment or a residual echo. She was witnessing a council of the dead. There was no sound, no chanting or spoken word, but their fury was a silent scream that vibrated through the stones and into the marrow of her bones. It was not the simple anger of being falsely accused. It was the deep, seething rage of the powerless, the fury of mothers whose children were left to starve, of healers branded as hags, of women whose very existence had become a crime. It was a bitterness so potent it had curdled into a supernatural force, a curse that had outlived their mortal bodies. The emotion washed over Ilara in waves, a psychic torrent of betrayal, fear, and a thirst for vengeance so pure. It was terrifying. She felt their despair as her own, a suffocating weight of injustice that made her want to weep and scream simultaneously. One of the figures, taller than the rest, turned its head, its luminous eyes, pits of condensed sorrow and hate, swept across the circle and locked directly onto Ilara's hiding place. It had seen her. A jolt of pure terror, colder than the fog, shot through her. The collective attention of the entire spectral gathering shifted, pivoting from their internal rage to the living, breathing intruder in their sacred space. The silent scream of their anger was now directed at her, a single, unified force of rejection. The air grew so cold it burned her lungs, and the stones themselves seemed to hum with a low, threatening frequency. Move. The command came from a place deeper than thought, a primal instinct for survival. She scrambled backward, away from the stone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did not look back. She turned and ran, blindly, desperately, crashing through the heather and stumbling over unseen rocks. The fog seemed to clutch at her, cold, damp fingers trying to pull her back into the circle, into their eternal angry vigil. She ran until her legs burned and her chest felt like it would burst, driven only by the overwhelming need to escape that concentrated hatred. She did not know how long she ran, but gradually, imperceptibly, the whiteness around her began to thin. A faint grey light seeped into the world. The featureless void resolved into the familiar shapes of the moorland slope. The path, blessedly solid and real, appeared beneath her feet. She staggered onto it, collapsing to her knees, gasping great, ragged sobs of relief and terror. The first rays of the dawn sun, weak and pale, broke over the horizon, burning away the last remnants of the fog. Ilara looked back up at Pendle Hill. It stood silent and immense against the brightening sky, its slopes now green and innocent in the morning light. There was no sign of the stone circle, no trace of the spectral gathering, but she knew. The encounter was seared into her soul, a brand of otherworldly fury. She had gone to the hill seeking a connection to history and had found instead a living, breathing curse. She would finish her hike, she would return to her life, but nothing would ever be the same. The memory of those burning, accusatory eyes in the mist and the crushing weight of their ancient, undimmed anger would walk with her always, a haunting far more profound than any ghostly apparition. Pendle Hill had shared its secret, and the price of that knowledge was a piece of her peace, forever left behind in the cold, silent circle on the moor. There is a cold that has nothing to do with temperature, a chill that originates not from the air but from the soul of a place, a glacial breath exhaled by history itself. Chillingham Castle wore this cold like a second skin, its ancient Northumbrian stones seeming to radiate an aura of preserved misery that could be felt long before one crossed the drawbridge. To the man who joined the afternoon tour, a ghost hunter named Silas, who had traded in the theoretical for the tangible, this deep-seated frost was not a warning, but a welcome. He moved with the group through the grand staterooms, his ears filtering out the guide's recitation of battles and bloodlines, listening instead for the quieter, more desperate stories. The ones told in a sudden drop in temperature, a flicker of movement in a dusty corner, a whisper from a stone that had witnessed too much. His equipment was minimal, a high-sensitivity thermometer, an EMF meter tucked in his pocket, and the finely tuned instrument of his own intuition. He had learned that the most profound evidence was often that which was felt, not recorded. The tour descended into the castle's underbelly, leaving the faded opulence above for a realm of raw, unadorned stone. The dungeons were a warren of low, vaulted chambers, their air thick and stagnant, smelling of wet earth and the iron tang of old rust. This was where the castle's carefully curated history fell away, revealing the brutal reality upon which it was built. The guide's voice dropped to a hushed, respectful tone as he described the prisoners of war and political rivals who had been left to die in these lightless pits, their names erased but their suffering absorbed by the relentless stone. It was here, in the deepest of these chambers, that the atmosphere shifted dramatically. A wave of intense, bone-deep cold slammed into Silas, so sudden and severe it stole his breath. His digital thermometer's reading plummeted, the numbers dropping into the single digits in a matter of seconds. This was no draft. It was a pocket of absolute zero, a bubble of supernatural frost that existed in defiance of the laws of physics. The other tourists, huddled in their jackets, seemed to feel only the general dampness, but for Silas it was a targeted assault, a cold that felt intelligent and hostile. And then, as he stood shivering in that frigid pocket, he heard it. faint at first, a distant, ragged thread of sound, then growing in clarity and volume until it filled the small space. A scream. It was not one voice, but a chorus of them, layered over centuries, a cacophony of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the sound of men being broken on the rack, of flesh seared by hot irons, of souls being torn from bodies in this very room. The sound was not in the air, but in his mind, a psychic echo of the dungeon's primary function, its purpose as a place of pain screaming across time. The tour moved on, the tourists filing out with relieved murmurs, eager to return to the sunlight. Silas lingered for a moment longer, the phantom screams still ringing in his ears, the unnatural cold clinging to his clothes like a shroud. He knew then that the official tour was merely a prelude, a sanitized version of the truth. The real story of Chillingham was down here, in the dark, and it was a story that demanded a private audience. As the group ascended back to the world of tapestries and tea rooms, a plan solidified in his mind. He would return after hours. He would find a way past the locks and the alarms. The castle's heart was not in its great hall, but in its torture chamber, and he felt a pull, a dark magnetism drawing him back to that room of stone and sorrow, to the epicenter of its chilling, violent history. The ghosts of Chillingham were not subtle, they were screaming to be heard, and he was the only one listening. The silence of the castle after dark was a different entity from the quiet of the day. It was a thick, heavy blanket that smothered sound, a listening silence that seemed to absorb the very beat of his heart. Silas moved through the blackened halls like a phantom himself, the beam of his flashlight a frail, trembling spear against an ocean of ancient darkness. He had bypassed the modern security with a ghost hunter's cunning, and now he was alone with the stones and whatever memories they held. The pull was undeniable, a psychic undertow drawing him back down into the earth, to the source of the cold and the screams. The grand staircases and portrait galleries were mere antechambers. The true throne room of Chillingham's despair was its torture chamber. The air grew denser and colder with every step down the narrow, spiraling stone staircase. The smell changed, too, from dusty antiquity to something sharper, more metallic, like old blood and ozone. He pushed open the heavy, iron-studded door, and it swung inward with a groan that sounded like a soul in torment. The chamber beyond was small, circular, and windowless, a tomb designed for the living. His flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating the instruments of its purpose. A rusted iron rack dominated the center, its rollers stained a dark, permanent brown. Manacles hung from the walls, their cold iron waiting for wrists that had long since turned to dust. A brazier, filled with ancient cold ash, stood in one corner, and beside it, a table held an array of pincers, probes, and knives, their shapes grotesque and unambiguous in the stark light. He had only just stepped fully into the room when the door slammed shut behind him, not with a bang, but with a soft, definitive thud that was far more terrifying. The sound echoed in the small space, and then the temperature plummeted. It was the same targeted cold from the tour, but now it was absolute, a deep freeze that seized his lungs and made the metal of his flashlight almost too painful to hold. The beam flickered, dimmed, and then died completely, plunging him into a blackness so profound it felt solid. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his throat, but it was choked off by the presence that now filled the room. It did not manifest as a figure, but as a concentration of the darkness itself, a patch of void that swirled and coalesced before the rack. From this roiling blackness, an intelligence emerged, ancient, patient, and utterly devoid of mercy. This was not the ghost of a victim, but of a perpetrator, the torturer. His presence was a stain on the air, a psychic residue of cruelty so refined it had become a permanent part of the chamber's atmosphere. Silas could not see him, but he felt him, a consciousness that took a slow, savoring pleasure in the fresh fear radiating from a living soul. Then the visions began. They did not appear before his eyes, but were projected directly into his mind, immersive and horrifically vivid. He was no longer Silas the investigator. He was a succession of the damned. He felt the rough hemp of a noose around his own neck, not tightening, just resting, a promise of the drop to come. He felt the searing, unimaginable pain as his joints were slowly, methodically pulled apart on the rack, the pops and tears of sinew a deafening roar in his ears. He smelled his own flesh burning as a white-hot brand was. Pressed to his chest, the sizzle and the scent of cooking meat making him gag. He experienced the terror of the drowning chair, the icy water closing over his head, the frantic, useless struggle for a breath that would not come. Each vision was a perfect, agonizing snapshot of a past atrocity, delivered with clinical precision by the spectral torturer, a guided tour of the chamber's greatest hits of suffering. The ghost was not just showing him history, it was making him live it, forcing him to wear the pain of every soul who had screamed in this room. The cumulative weight of centuries of agony was too much for a single mind to bear. The sensory overload of broken bones, seared flesh, and suffocation short-circuited his consciousness. A final, silent scream echoed in his skull as his legs gave way. He collapsed to the cold stone floor, the vision still flashing behind his eyelids, the phantom pains searing through his nervous system. The torturer's presence lingered for a moment, a shadow of satisfaction at a lesson well taught, before the darkness swallowed Silas whole. He was found hours later by the castle's caretaker, alerted by an internal alarm he could not explain. The man lay in a heap on the floor of the torture chamber, ice-cold to the touch but alive. He was mumbling, his eyes wide and unseeing, focused on a horror only he could witness. They carried him out, a broken man babbling about lost souls and iron and the cold, so cold. The words were fragmented, torn from a psyche that had been flayed open by a direct encounter with evil. He spoke of faces in the darkness, of pleas for mercy that went unanswered, of a sorrow so vast it had its own gravity, pulling all hope into its black heart. He was a ghost hunter who had found not just a ghost, but the very essence of damnation, and the chilling, brutal truth of Chillingham Castle had left him a hollow man, his mind a prison for the lost souls he had been forced to become. A ruin holds a different kind of ghost, not a soul trapped within walls, but the ghost of the walls themselves, the skeletal remains of a life long extinguished. Berry Pomeroy Castle, nestled in a wooded Devon valley, was a masterpiece of this beautiful decay. Its sandstone walls, warmed by the afternoon sun, were a tapestry of crumbling grandeur, ivy-clad and open to the sky. For Ilara, an artist whose medium was charcoal and the subtle play of light on stone, it was not a place of terror, but of profound inspiration. She had come not to chase phantoms, but to capture the elegant sorrow of the place, to translate the poetry of fallen arches and empty window frames onto her large, textured sheets of paper. Her backpack was heavy not with ghost hunting gear, but with sketch pads and a multitude of pencils, their points sharpened to a fine, anticipatory keen. She settled in the shadow of the gatehouse, the colossal structure still imposing despite the gaping holes where its doors had once been. The stories of the castle's resident spectre, the White Lady, were known to her, a tale of a daughter of the house, Margaret de Pomeroy, imprisoned and starved to death by a jealous sister. It was a tragic, Gothic romance, the kind of story that clung to such places, but Ilara saw it as simply another layer of the castle's history, a human narrative etched upon the stone. She opened her largest pad, selected a soft charcoal stick, and let her hand begin to move, her eyes tracing the elegant lines of a collapsed fireplace in what was once the great hall. The sun dipped lower, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the grassy floor. As she worked, her focus narrowed to the interplay of light and dark, the way a surviving mullioned window framed a square of perfect blue sky. It was in this state of deep, artistic absorption that a new sensation began to seep into her awareness. It was not a chill or a feeling of dread, but something entirely different, something soft and encompassing. A profound sense of maternal warmth settled over her, a feeling of protective, unconditional love that was as tangible as the sun on her skin. It felt like a presence standing just behind her shoulder, not watching her work, but approving of it, encouraging it. The air itself seemed to grow softer, the birdsong from the surrounding woods fading into a respectful hush. This was no malevolent spirit, It was a guardian, a nurturing energy that had outlasted the stones it once called home. Her hand, usually so deliberate and controlled, began to move with a will of its own. Without conscious thought, her charcoal strayed from the architectural details she had been meticulously rendering. On a fresh corner of the paper, her fingers flew, sketching not the ruin before her, but a figure. It was the rough, swift outline of a woman, in a flowing, old-fashioned gown, her form suggested by just a few masterful strokes. She stood not in the ruined hall, but seemed to be in a room, one hand resting gently on a cradle that was only hinted at. A mere suggestion of curved wood. Her head was bowed, her posture one of infinite sadness and devotion. Ilara blinked, coming out of her trance-like state, and stared at the unexpected addition to her sketch. She had not seen this woman, had not intended to draw her. The figure felt like an intrusion, a subconscious doodle, yet it was rendered with a skill and emotional depth that felt beyond her. Puzzled, but not alarmed, she set the pad aside to pack her things. The light was failing, painting the ruins in shades of rose and gold. As she gathered her pencils, her eyes flicked back to the sketch pad, now lying flat on the grass. Her breath caught in her throat. The drawing of the woman had changed. The lines were no longer static. The figure's bowed head was now slightly raised, as if she were looking up, listening. The hand that had been resting on the cradle now hovered just above it, the fingers curled as if in the act of letting go. It was a minute shift, a change in posture so subtle it could almost be dismissed as a trick of the shifting light. But Ilara knew her own marks, the pressure of her own charcoal. She had not drawn it that way. The figure on the paper had moved. The maternal presence she had felt so strongly now seemed to be bleeding from the stone into her art. A sorrowful spirit, using her talent as a vessel, not to threaten, but to communicate a story that was etched not in sandstone, but in the enduring, heartbreaking language of a mother's love. The sun bled its final, defiant colors across the sky, staining the high, scattered clouds with hues of rose and violet, before surrendering to the encroaching twilight. Ilara could not stay away. The castle, now a collection of dark, brooding silhouettes against the deepening blue, exerted a magnetic pull stronger than any she had ever known. The maternal warmth, the inexplicably moving sketch, these were not puzzles to be solved from a distance, but invitations into a mystery that resonated in the very core of her being. Leaving her modern world behind, she crossed the grassy threshold of the gatehouse once more, the evening air cool and sweet, with the scent of damp earth and night-blooming flowers. She carried only a single fresh sketch pad and a handful of charcoal, a pilgrim returning to a sacred site. The ruins were transformed by the absence of light. The warm, honey-colored stone of the afternoon was now a cold, monochromatic grey. The empty windows were pits of absolute blackness, and the jagged tops of the walls seemed to claw at the first faint stars. She made her way to the same spot in the great hall, the site of her earlier, uncanny inspiration. The air was still, the silence profound, broken only by the rustle of an unseen creature in the undergrowth. She did not set up to draw. She simply stood, waiting, her senses stretched taut, listening not with her ears but with her soul. It began as a soft pearlescent glow in the deepest shadows of the hall, near the remains of the grand staircase. The light was not a reflection, but an emanation, a gentle radiance that grew in intensity without illuminating its surroundings. From this pool of luminescence, a figure began to form, weaving itself from strands of moonlight and memory. It was the woman from her sketch, but rendered in a reality far more vivid than charcoal could ever capture. She was the White Lady, clad in a gown of ethereal white that seemed to flow like liquid silk, though no breeze stirred the still air. Her face was pale and beautiful, etched with a sorrow so deep it was a physical presence, but there was no malice in her eyes, only an ocean of ancient grief. She did not speak, not in words that could be heard. Instead, her story unfolded directly in Ilara's mind, a silent, heartbreaking narrative conveyed through emotion and image. The artist saw a younger version of the Lady Margaret, her heart full of a pure, joyous love for a child, a baby boy whose laughter was the sun in her world. She felt the fierce, protective warmth of a mother's devotion, a love that was her entire existence. And then, the betrayal. The vision shifted to the face of her sister Eleanor, twisted not by hatred, but by a bitter, all-consuming jealousy. The emotion was a poison, sharp and acidic, flooding Ilara's senses. She felt the cruel calculation, the cold decision to remove not just a rival, but the source of Margaret's happiness. The next wave of images was one of claustrophobic terror. The thick, cold stones of a tower room, not in this grand hall, but somewhere higher in the castle, a place meant for light and air turned into a sealed tomb. The desperate pounding of small frantic fists against an unyielding oak door. The weakening cries of a child, growing fainter, thirst and hunger carving away his life day by agonizing day. And through it all, Ilara felt Margaret's own torment, a mirror of her son's suffering amplified by a mother's helplessness. She was not imprisoned with him, but forced to listen, to bear witness to the slow, deliberate murder of her child. A punishment designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. The final vision was the most devastating, a profound, echoing silence from the tower, a silence that screamed of a tiny, stilled heart, and the subsequent, soul-shattering desolation that followed, a grief so absolute it had the power to kill. Margaret's own death soon after was not a release, but a continuation of that same emptiness, an eternal yearning for the child stolen from her. The weight of this shared sorrow, the visceral experience of a mother's ultimate loss, was too immense for Ilara's mind to contain. It flooded her, a tidal wave of empathetic agony that overwhelmed her senses. The world tilted, the spectral glow of the White Lady swimming before her eyes. The last thing she saw was the ghost's face, a mask of tender, apologetic sorrow, before the darkness rushed up to claim her. Her legs gave way, and she crumpled to the cool, damp grass, the sketchpad falling from her limp fingers. She awoke to the chill of deep night, the moon a cold sliver overhead. Her head throbbed, and her body felt heavy, as if she had wept for hours. The White Lady was gone. The great hall was once again just a collection of broken stones under a vast, indifferent sky. But something within her had fundamentally shifted. As she pushed herself up, her hand brushed against the fallen sketchpad. Picking it up, she saw that a new drawing covered the page, not her own work, but a single perfectly rendered image of a mother cradling a child, their forms fused in an embrace of both love and heartbreaking farewell. It was a final gift, a confirmation. Ilara did not feel fear. She felt a new, profound understanding of grief, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a permanent, shaping force, a love that had outlasted even death itself. The ghost of Berry Pomeroy was not a wailing spectre or a vengeful spirit. She was a monument to maternal love, a sorrow so pure and enduring it had become part of the landscape. Gathering her things, Ilara walked slowly from the ruins, the cold night air no longer feeling hostile. She carried the White Lady's story with her now, not as a terrifying secret, but as a sacred trust. Her art would never be the same. It would henceforth speak of the invisible architecture of loss, of the love that ghosts are made of, and the quiet, endless grief that can bind a soul to a place long after the stones have fallen. There is a peculiar fame that attaches itself to a place branded the most haunted, a reputation that draws not just the curious, but the determined, those who seek to capture the uncanny and pin it down like a butterfly in a display case. For the man with the documentary filmmaker's eye and a sound recordist's sensitive ear, Pluckley was not just a picturesque Kentish village of oast houses and hop fields. It was a title holder, a champion of the supernatural, and he had come to audit its claims. His van was a mobile studio, packed with cameras, parabolic microphones, and hard drives waiting to be filled with evidence. He believed in the power of the lens and the microphone to reveal truths hidden from the naked eye, to isolate the signal of the paranormal from the noise of the mundane world. He began his work in the daylight, under a sky of soft English grey. The village, nestled in the gentle rolling hills, presented a face of idyllic tranquility. Cottages built of weathered brick and hung with vibrant flower baskets lined the narrow lanes. It was a scene of postcard perfection, a place that seemed to actively resist the macabre reputation that clung to its name. He started at the Black Horse Pub, a building of low beams and warm firelight, where the locals gathered. Over a pint of bitter, he interviewed the publican, a stout man with a pragmatic demeanor. The man spoke of the village's spectral residents not as myths, but as inconvenient facts of life, like a troublesome pothole in the road. He confirmed the two most famous phantoms, the Screaming Man, a spectral brickmaker said to have met his end by falling into a vat of boiling clay, his agonized cries still echoing from the old brickyard, and the Highwayman, a shadowy figure on a phantom horse, who was often reported galloping down the lane near Daring Wood, his passage marked by the thunder of unseen hooves and a feeling of desperate flight. The filmmaker moved on, his camera rolling as he walked the very paths these phantoms were said to haunt. He interviewed an elderly woman tending her garden, her hands caked with soil, who spoke of seeing the highwayman's cloaked form one misty autumn evening, a fleeting shape that vanished into the hedgerow. She spoke with a matter-of-factness that was more convincing than any dramatic retelling. In the churchyard of St. Nicholas, he found the grave of the Red Lady, another local spectre, and felt a distinct, localized chill as he filmed the weathered headstone. The stories were consistent, detailed, and delivered without a hint of performance. The villagers of Pluckley did not seem to enjoy their fame. They endured it, their lives intertwined with a tapestry of grief and history that would not stay neatly in the past. As the afternoon waned, casting long, languid shadows across the green, the filmmaker began his real work. The quality of the light changed, the bright colors of day softening into the muted tones of evening. A thin, ground-hugging mist began to uncoil from the River Star, threading its way through the fields and lanes, lending the village an ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere. This was the transition, the moment when the village of the living began to make room for the village of the dead. He drove his van to strategic points around the parish, his movements methodical and precise. At the site of the old brickyard, now a quiet, overgrown hollow, he mounted a thermal camera on a tripod, its lens staring into the gathering gloom. Along the dark, tree-canopied stretch of road where the highwayman rode, he concealed motion-activated cameras in the undergrowth, their infrared LEDs invisible to the human eye. High-sensitivity microphones were positioned at both locations, their furry windshields like strange, listening fungi growing from the soil, ready to capture any whisper, any sigh, any scream that the night might offer. By the time true darkness fell, Pluckley was wrapped in a deep, velvety blackness, punctuated only by the occasional golden square of a cottage window. The filmmaker stood alone in the churchyard, the silent, watchful eye of his main camera pointed towards the Daring Arms, another reputedly haunted spot. The air was cold and still, the mist now a persistent, glowing presence in the beam of his headlamp. The cheerful daytime village was gone, replaced by something older, quieter, and infinitely more watchful. He had turned the village into his set, its haunted corners now monitored by his unblinking electronic sentinels. The stage was set, the equipment was live, and all that remained was for the actors to make their entrance. The most haunted village in England was holding its breath, and he was there, in the center of it all, waiting for the curtain to rise on its ghostly performance. The transition from dusk to full night in Pluckley was not a gentle fading, but a closing, as if a great velvet lid had been lowered over the village, sealing it in a world of its own. The filmmaker's electronic sentinels stood silent and watchful in the darkness, their tiny status lights glowing like fireflies in the oppressive black. He had retreated to the mobile command center of his van, parked at a vantage point overlooking the crossroads near the church. The interior was a cocoon of soft, screen-lit warmth, a stark contrast to the ancient chill seeping in from outside. Multiple feeds glowed on the monitors before. Dim, the thermal view of the brickyard, the grainy infrared of the highwayman's lane, the audio levels from the microphones dancing in flat green lines. The wait was a form of meditation, a balancing act between professional patience and the primal urge to flee the creeping unease that the village exuded after dark. It began on the monitor for the highwayman's lane. The motion sensor triggered, its alert a soft chime in the quiet van. The infrared camera feed showed nothing at first, just the dark tunnel of trees and the mist coiling over the tarmac. Then, a sound began to build on the corresponding audio feed, a low, rhythmic rumble that grew steadily louder. It was the unmistakable, percussive beat of hooves, not the gentle trot of a farm horse, but the frantic, headlong gallop of a beast pushed to its limits. The sound swelled, a thunder of spectral pursuit that seemed to shake the very speakers, yet the camera's view remained obstinately empty. Then, for a fraction of a second, a shape flickered into existence. A tall, dark horse, its eyes wild and nostrils flared, a cloaked rider leaning low over its neck, his face a pale, determined blur. They were there, and then gone. A phantom impression burned onto the digital file, the sound of their passage fading as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that vibrated with the memory of their flight. The filmmaker stared, his heart thumping, a slow smile of vindication spreading across his face. He had it, the phantom coach, the highwayman, captured. No sooner had the hoofbeats faded than a new sound erupted, this time from the speaker connected to the brickyard microphone. It was a scream, but unlike any human sound he had ever recorded. It was a raw, guttural shriek of pure, unendurable agony, a sound that seemed to tear itself from a soul being burned alive. It was the screaming man. The cry was not a single event, but a wave of torment that rose, peaked in a soul-shattering crescendo, and then broke into ragged, choking sobs before starting the cycle anew. It was a sound of such profound, hopeless suffering that it felt like a violation to even listen to it. The thermal camera showed no heat signature, no source for the sound that was now filling the van with its horrific symphony. This was not the clean, historical ghost he had anticipated. This was raw, undiluted pain, a wound in time that had never healed. He could not sit and listen. The documentary was no longer an abstract project. It had become a rescue mission, a compulsion to find the source of this endless agony. Grabbing a handheld camera and a powerful flashlight, he left the safety of the van and plunged into the misty night. The screams guided him, a terrible beacon, leading him away from the lanes and into a fallow field on the edge of the village. The ground was soft and wet underfoot, the mist so thick his flashlight beam seemed to travel only a few feet before being swallowed. The screams were louder here, all around him, a cacophony of despair that seemed to emanate from the very air and soil. He swung the flashlight beam in a wide arc, and the light fell upon a figure standing alone in the center of the field. It was a man, or the ghost of one, dressed in the tattered, mud-stained uniform of a soldier from a forgotten war. He was not screaming now. He stood perfectly still, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped under an invisible, impossible weight. He was semi-transparent, his form shimmering with a faint phosphorescent glow, and through his chest, the filmmaker could see the mist and the dark outlines of the trees beyond. This was not the brickmaker. This was someone else, a soul lost not to an industrial accident, but to the organized violence of battle, a tragedy that had somehow found its way to this quiet English field. The ghost slowly raised its head. Its face was not one of agony, but of a weary, bottomless sorrow, the kind that comes from having seen too much, from having done too much. Its eyes, hollow and lightless, met the filmmaker's gaze across the distance. In that moment, there was no fear, only a profound, shared understanding of loss. The ghost's hand twitched, a half-formed gesture towards something only it could see, and then it began to fade, dissolving into the mist like a sigh, leaving behind only the memory of its sorrow and the lingering coppery taste of old battlefields in the air. The filmmaker stood alone in the field, the silence now absolute and deafening. He lowered his camera. He had everything he needed. The phantom coach, the screams, the soldier. He had captured the definitive portrait of the most haunted village in England. He had his film. But as he trudged back through the wet grass towards the welcoming lights of his van, the triumph felt hollow, ashes in his mouth. The ghosts of Pluckley were not entertainments. They were real, suffering entities, and he had profited from their pain. The footage on his hard drives was not just evidence, it was a collection of sorrows, and the weight of it settled deep into his bones, leaving him with a completed film and a soul profoundly, irrevocably unsettled. There is a particular loneliness to a moorland inn, a sense of being an outpost of warmth and light in a vast, untamed darkness. The Jamaica Inn, squat and solid on the high, windswept spine of Bodmin Moor, was such a place, a refuge of thick granite walls and low, smoke-blackened beams against the desolate beauty that surrounded it. For the traveller who pulled his weary car into the gravel yard, the inn was more than just a bed for the night. It was a destination steeped in the very history that had drawn him to Cornwall. He was a writer of local histories, a man who found more truth in the folklore of a place than in its official records. And the Jamaica Inn's reputation as a former smuggler's haunt was a siren song he could not resist. Inside, the air was thick with the comforting smells of wood smoke, roasting meat, and old polish. A low fire crackled in a vast hearth, its light dancing across copper pots and dark, age-polished wood. He took a seat in a corner of the bustling taproom, a pint of local ale before him, and let the atmosphere wash over him. The other patrons were a mix of locals and tourists, their conversations a pleasant murmur, but it was the landlord, a man with a seafarer's weathered face and a storyteller's gleam in his eye, who held the real treasure. After learning of his guest's interest, the man leaned on the bar, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone as he wove tales of the inn's notorious past. He spoke of the free traders who had once used the inn as their base, their pack trains of contraband, brandy, silk and tobacco, moving like ghosts across the misty moor under the cover of darkness. He told of secret tunnels and hidden cellars, of signals flashed from the inn's windows to ships waiting off the coast, and of the violent ends that met those who crossed the smuggling gangs. And of course he spoke of the ghosts, the restless spirits of those smugglers who had never left, their shadows still seen flitting through the corridors, their whispered conversations sometimes heard in the dead of night when the wind was still. Later, climbing the creaking staircase to his room under the eaves, the traveller felt a thrill of anticipation. His chamber was small and cosy, the ceiling sloping sharply, the window a small, deep-set portal looking out onto the boundless, star-strewn blackness of the moor. The wind moaned softly around the corners of the building, a lonely sound that seemed to carry the echoes of 2 centuries. He prepared for bed, the landlord's stories swirling in his mind, the romanticism of the smuggler's life blending with the chilling reality of their dangerous trade. He extinguished the lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the inn settle around him, the old timbers groaning like the hull of a ship. He must have drifted into a light sleep, for he was awakened not by a sound, but by a change in the quality of the darkness. A patch of deeper shadow had detached itself from the corner of the room near the fireplace. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in the bulky, indistinct clothing of a bygone era. A heavy coat, perhaps, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. The figure was opaque, a solid slice of night, and it radiated a cold that had nothing to do with the moorland air. This was no residual echo. The traveller felt its focused attention, a desperate, intelligent presence that had waited a long time for this moment. His blood ran cold, but a historian's curiosity overrode his fear. He lay perfectly still, watching as the shadowy smuggler raised an arm, its form seeming to ripple at the edges. A translucent, glowing hand emerged from the darkness of its sleeve, pointing with a single, insistent finger towards the wall beside the fireplace. The traveller's eyes followed the gesture. There was nothing there but the uneven surface of the old plaster and the dark granite stones of the hearth. The ghost's arm remained outstretched, its silent, urgent plea filling the room. The message was clear. Look, here. Summoning every ounce of his courage, the traveller slipped from the bed. The air around the spectre was frigid, a pocket of winter in the warm room. He approached the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran his hands over the plaster where the ghost pointed, feeling for a seam, a catch, anything out of the ordinary. His fingers found it, a nearly imperceptible hairline crack outlining a small square section of the wall, cleverly disguised to look like part of the natural texture. Pressing his palm against it, he felt a faint click. The small panel swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing a dark cavity within the thick wall. Reaching inside, his fingers brushed against something rough and fibrous. Sacking. He pulled the object out. It was a small, heavy bundle, wrapped in oilcloth that was brittle with age. He carried it to the small table by the window, the moonlight providing just enough illumination. With trembling hands he untied the rotting cord and unfolded the cloth. Inside lay a collection of objects that told a silent story: a tarnished silver Spanish coin, a small, ornately carved pipe made of meerschaum, a woman's locket with a faded miniature portrait inside, and a few flakes of a dark, pungent leaf that still carried the faint, sweet scent of long-forgotten tobacco. This was not a king's ransom in contraband. It was a personal stash, the hidden treasures of a single man, perhaps his last ill-gotten gains, or tokens of a life he could never return to. He looked back towards the fireplace. The shadowy figure was still there, but its posture had changed. The desperate pointing had ceased. The arm was lowered, and the smuggler's form seemed less solid, beginning to soften at the edges like ink dissolving in water. The oppressive cold was receding, replaced by a gentle warmth returning from the hearth. There was a new feeling in the room now, a profound sense of release, of a burden finally laid down. The ghost looked at the traveller, and though it had no visible face, the traveller felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude, a silent thank you that seemed to emanate from the very air. Then the figure simply faded, dissipating into the ambient darkness of the room until nothing remained. The traveller sat for a long time, the old contraband spread before him on the table. He understood. The smuggler's spirit had not been trapped by violence or a desire for revenge, but by a secret, by the weight of a hidden truth. His treasure had been lost, and with it, a piece of his story. By revealing the hiding place, by bringing these forgotten tokens back into the light, the traveller had given the ghost what it needed most: closure. The restless soul, its earthly business finally concluded, had been able to move on. The Jamaica Inn would always have its stories, but one of its oldest, most patient ghosts was now at peace, its secret entrusted to a historian who would, in his own way, ensure that the smuggler's small human story was never entirely lost to the mists of the moor. There is a weight to a place that has served as both court and execution ground, a gravity that settles in the floorboards and seeps from the very plaster, a silent, solemn acknowledgement of the lives judged and ended within its walls. The Skirrid Mountain Inn, nestled in the shadow of its namesake hill in Wales, carried this burden with a quiet, sombre dignity. Its whitewashed walls and low, sloping roof spoke of centuries of hospitality, but its ancient, crooked timbers and the faint, persistent chill in the air whispered of a far darker purpose. For the couple who stepped through its heavy oak door, it was to be a romantic getaway, a night in a building older than the concept of America, a brush with history over a fine meal and a glass of local wine. They were drawn by the charm, not the infamy, their minds on candlelight and old-world ambience, not on the nooses that had once swung from the beam above the staircase. The innkeeper, a woman with kind eyes and a voice as soft as the Welsh rain, seated them in the cosy, low-ceilinged restaurant. A fire crackled in the inglenook fireplace, casting a warm, dancing light across the uneven flagstones and dark wood panels. As they perused the menu, she brought them a carafe of water, and with a gentle, almost apologetic air, began to speak of the inn's past. She told them how, for over 300 years, the upper floor of the inn had served as a courtroom for the lordship of Abergavenny, a place where justice was dispensed with swift, brutal finality. And then, her voice dropping even lower, she pointed to the massive blackened oak beam that spanned the room just beyond the foot of the stairs. It was from that beam, she explained, that the condemned were hanged, their bodies sometimes left to swing as a grim warning to the local populace. The inn, for all its warmth and charm, was built upon a foundation of judgment and death. The couple listened, their initial delight tempered by a creeping unease. The man, a pragmatic lawyer, tried to frame it as a fascinating historical footnote. The woman, more sensitive to atmosphere, felt a subtle shift in the room, as if the shadows in the corners had grown deeper, more watchful. They ate their meal, the food excellent, but their appetites diminished. As the evening wore on, the woman began to feel a peculiar sensation, a tightness around her throat that had nothing to do with her scarf. It was a constricting pressure, subtle at first, like the collar of a shirt buttoned too high, but it gradually intensified. It became a distinct band-like feeling, a phantom noose tightening with a slow, inexorable force that made it difficult to swallow and sent a cold trickle of fear down her spine. She discreetly loosened her scarf, but the sensation persisted, a horrifying, invisible necklace of dread. She looked at her partner, about to voice her discomfort, when her eyes were drawn to the foot of the staircase. The air there seemed to shimmer, like heat haze on a summer road, but cold, bitterly cold. From this distortion, a figure began to materialize. It was a man, gaunt and pale, dressed in the rough, homespun clothes of a forgotten century. His hands were bound behind his back, his face a mask of terrified resignation, his eyes wide with the knowledge of his imminent end. He was semi-transparent, a photograph fading into view, and he looked directly at her, his mouth moving in a silent plea for mercy that would never come. A gasp caught in her own constricted throat. Before she could point him out, another apparition flickered into existence beside the first, then another. A small group of condemned men stood huddled in the space by the stairs, their forms shifting in and out of. Focus, a silent, sorrowful gathering of the lost. They were not threatening, not malevolent. They were simply there, trapped in the final agonizing moments of their lives. Their terror and despair imprinted on the atmosphere of the room like a permanent stain. The phantom tightness around the woman's neck became a vice, a sympathetic reaction to their long-ago suffering that was so visceral she felt herself beginning to choke. Her partner finally noticed her distress, her pale face and panicked eyes. He followed her gaze to the empty space by the stairs, seeing nothing but shadows and old wood, yet feeling the temperature in their corner of the room plummet. The warmth from the fireplace no longer reached them. They were sitting in an island of supernatural frost. The jovial chatter from the other tables seemed to come from a million miles away. The woman's hand flew to her throat, her breath coming in short, ragged pants. The apparitions stared, their silent lament a psychic weight that was crushing the air from her lungs. That was enough. The man threw his napkin on the table, his historical curiosity utterly evaporated, replaced by a primal need to protect, to escape. He tossed a handful of banknotes onto the table, not waiting for the bill, and helped his trembling wife to her feet. They did not look back, did not offer explanations to the concerned innkeeper. They stumbled out of the warm, firelit room, through the heavy door, and into the cold, blessedly normal night air. The phantom pressure on the woman's throat vanished the moment they crossed the threshold, but the memory of it and the haunting, resigned faces of the condemned men were seared into their minds. They scrambled into their car, the engine roaring to life, and sped away from the inn, its picturesque white walls now seeming like a sepulchre, its ancient charm forever replaced by the terrifying, tangible memory of the noose and the desperate, silent ghosts who would forever call it home. Every writer knows the tyranny of the blank page, the silent, accusing whiteness that can stifle inspiration before a single word is set down. For Elara, a novelist whose well of ideas had run dry, the Mermaid Inn in Rye was to be her sanctuary, a place where the very air, thick with centuries of salt and story, would whisper its secrets to her. The ancient inn, a labyrinth of timber frames and crooked floors nestled in the cobbled heart of the medieval town, was a character in its own right, its history a tapestry woven with threads of smugglers, sailors, and the restless dead. She booked a room with a writing desk that looked out over the misty Romney Marsh, hoping the change of scenery would be the key that unlocked the stubborn door to her imagination. Her room was a small, cozy space under the eaves, dominated by a heavy, oak-beamed bed and the promised desk. The air smelled of beeswax, old wood, and the faint, briny tang of the sea. As dusk settled over the town, she lit a candle, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows that brought the carved mermaid on the room's main beam to life. Exhausted from her journey and the mental strain of her block, she eventually surrendered to sleep, the candle guttering out beside her. Her dreams were not of plotlines or characters, but of the sea. She dreamed she was floating in a cold, dark ocean, and from the depths below, a figure rose towards her, a mermaid with hair like flowing kelp and eyes the color of deep water. She was beautiful, but her face was etched with a profound, silent sorrow. She reached a pale, webbed hand towards Elara, not in threat, but in a gesture of desperate supplication, her mouth forming a silent word that was lost in the dream currents before Elara could decipher it. She awoke with a start, the first grey light of dawn filtering through the leaded window. The dream had been so vivid the scent of salt water seemed to linger in the air. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, she sat up, and a jolt of pure disbelief shot through her. The room was not as she had left it. The heavy wooden chair from the desk was now positioned squarely in the center of the room, facing the bed. A small porcelain vase that had held dried lavender on the mantelpiece was now on the floorboards beside the chair, its contents scattered in a fragrant purple circle. Most unsettling of all, the quilt that had been neatly folded at the foot of the bed was now draped over the back of the chair, its patterns arranged to vaguely resemble a flowing feminine form. It was not the chaotic disarray of an intruder or a poltergeist. It was a rearrangement, a deliberate, almost artistic composition, as if someone or something had been trying to communicate through the room's furniture while she slept. A shiver, not entirely of fear, traced its way down her spine. This was not the malevolent presence she had read about in other haunted tales. It was something else, something poignant and strange. Driven by a curiosity that overpowered her unease, she spent the morning in the inn's snug little library, poring over local histories and ghost lore. The Mermaid Inn had many spirits, but one story resonated with the imagery of her dream. It was the tale of a young sailor from the 18th century, a man named Thomas, who had fallen in love with a girl from Rye. He had promised to return from his next voyage to marry her, but his ship was lost in a storm off the coast. His body never recovered. His beloved, heartbroken, was said to have come to the inn every day thereafter, staring out to sea from a window until she herself faded away from grief. Locals claimed that sometimes the ghost of a weeping woman was seen near the old smuggler's passages, and more rarely, the spirit of the drowned sailor himself, drawn back to the place associated with his lost love. The pieces clicked into place with the gentle certainty of a key turning in a lock. The dream of the sorrowful mermaid was not a mermaid at all, but a metaphor, a spectral vision of the sailor's beloved, her human form twisted by the sea of her tears and the depths of her loss. The rearranged room was not a threat, but a plea, a ghost's attempt to set the stage, to provide the inspiration she so desperately sought. The spirit wasn't haunting her, it was asking for her help. Returning to her room, Elara sat at the desk, a fresh stack of paper before her. She picked up her pen, and for the first time in months, the words did not feel like a struggle. They flowed from her, a torrent of description and emotion. She did not write her own story, she wrote theirs. She wrote of Thomas, the young sailor with the scent of the sea in his clothes and a promise in his heart. She wrote of his love, Eleanor, her laughter like the ringing of the town bells, her faith as solid as the inn's foundations. She wrote of the storm, the terrifying power of the waves that devoured his ship and his future. And she wrote of Eleanor's vigil, the slow, agonizing erosion of hope as days turned into weeks, then months, then a lifetime of silent, endless waiting. She poured the ghost's sorrow onto the page, giving form to a grief that had lingered for centuries, giving names to the nameless and a voice to the silent. She wrote through the afternoon and into the evening, the scratch of her pen the only sound in the quiet room. As she wrote the final sentence, a description of the two lovers reunited, not in life, but in the peaceful, timeless realm of memory and spirit, a profound stillness settled over the room. The faint, residual chill that had clung to the air since her arrival simply vanished, replaced by a gentle, encompassing warmth. The oppressive weight of the unsaid, the unmourned, was gone. She had done it. She had listened to the ghost's silent story and had given it an ending. In the act of creation, she had not only broken her own writer's block, but had performed an act of spiritual charity, offering the piece of narrative. Resolution to a soul trapped by its own unfinished tale. The Mermaid Inn had given her its inspiration, and in return, she had given one of its oldest, saddest ghosts the gift of peace. In the heart of London, where the relentless pulse of the modern city beat strongest, there existed an island of Gilded Age opulence, a fortress of marble and gilt that held its history close, like a locket pressed to a silent beating heart. The Langham Hotel was such a place, its grand facade a testament to an era of gaslight and empire, its polished floors and crystal chandeliers whispering of a world that had not yet learned to hurry. For the man who pushed through its revolving doors, a business traveler named Robert, it was merely a convenient address, a comfortable bed between meetings, a sanctuary of Wi-Fi and room service from the chaos of the streets outside. He was a man of spreadsheets and projections, his mind a finely tuned instrument for the tangible and the quantifiable, and the ethereal held no currency in his world. The lobby was a cathedral of quiet luxury, the air scented with beeswax and the faint floral notes of expensive perfume. He checked in with the brisk efficiency of a man for whom time was a commodity, barely registering the ornate plasterwork on the ceiling or the silent, watchful portraits of long-dead dignitaries. The clerk, a young man with an old soul's eyes, handed him a heavy brass key and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his room was on the same floor as the grand ballroom. A magnificent space, the clerk said, a wistful note in his voice. Though it's been quiet this evening, no events scheduled. Robert accepted the key with a nod, his thoughts already on the report he needed to finish, the ghost of the clerk's words dissolving before they could take root in his pragmatic mind. He found his room, a plush, silent chamber of damask and mahogany, and set about the rituals of a business trip, hanging his suit, booting his laptop, ordering a late supper from the menu. It was as he sat at the small desk, the blue glow of his screen illuminating his face, that the first sound reached him. It was faint, a distant melodic thread woven through the hotel's profound silence. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and listened. It was music, the elegant, sweeping strains of a waltz, the kind played by a full orchestra. It was accompanied by the murmur of a crowd, the soft rustle of silk, the crystalline chime of laughter. The sounds seemed to be coming from down the hall, from the direction of the grand ballroom. He frowned, remembering the clerk's words. No event scheduled. Curiosity, a rare and unwelcome guest in his ordered mind, pricked at him. Finishing his work, he decided to investigate. He left his room and walked down the hushed, carpeted corridor towards the ballroom. The music grew louder as he approached, a vibrant, joyful sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. He could almost smell the ghost of cigar smoke and champagne. He reached the grand, double-doored entrance to the ballroom and peered through the small glass porthole set into the wood. The sight that met his eyes was one of breathtaking contradiction. The vast ballroom was utterly, completely empty. The parquet floor gleamed under the dimmed safety lights, barren of dancers. The gilded chairs were stacked neatly against the walls. The stage was vacant. Yet the music swelled around him, a phantom orchestra in full glorious swing, the laughter and chatter of 100 unseen guests filling the cavernous space with a party that wasn't there. It was a recording, he told himself, a faulty speaker system, a trick of the acoustics. But the sound was too rich, too dimensional, too alive. It was not a recording, it was a memory, a vibrant echo of a night long past, playing on an endless, spectral loop. He was about to turn away, to retreat to the solid reality of his room, when a movement in the far corner of the ballroom caught his eye. A figure stood beside one of the tall draped windows, a woman. She was not a trick of the light or a shadow. She was solid, real, and utterly out of time. She was dressed in the height of Victorian fashion, a gown of deep sapphire silk with a bustle and a tightly corseted waist, her pale shoulders bare, her dark hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure. She stood with her back to him, her posture one of elegant despair, her head bowed as if listening to the ghostly waltz that swirled through the empty room. Robert stood frozen, his hands still on the door handle, his rational mind scrambling for purchase and finding none. This was not a story in a book or a blurry photograph. This was a woman from another century, standing 20 feet away from him in a silent, empty ballroom that thrummed with the music of her time. He watched, his breath held, as she slowly turned. Her face was beautiful but tragically sad, her eyes dark pools of a sorrow so profound it seemed to dim the very air around her. She looked directly at him, and though he knew she could not possibly see him through the door, he felt the full heartbreaking weight of her gaze. For a long moment they remained that way, the modern businessman and the Victorian ghost, separated by a pane of glass and a chasm of time. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the phantom music faded, the laughter died, and the ballroom was returned to its true, profound silence. The woman gave a final, sorrowful look, and then simply dissolved, her form unraveling like smoke, until nothing remained but the memory of her grief. Robert stumbled back to his room, his heart thundering, his worldview lying in shattered pieces at his feet. Sleep was impossible. The image of the woman's face, her unbearable sadness, was burned onto the back of his eyelids. At first light, he went down to the lobby, his professional composure in tatters. He found the same clerk from the night before, and, his voice unsteady, described what he had seen. The clerk listened, his expression not one of surprise, but of quiet recognition. He nodded slowly. "You've seen her," he said, his voice soft with reverence. "That would be the German doctor's wife. Late 19th century. She was a guest here, attending a grand ball. She took her own life that very night, in her room, after discovering her husband had been unfaithful. She jumped from the window. They say she returns to the ballroom. To the last moment she felt any happiness, forever waiting for a waltz that ended in tragedy." The story, stark and human and terrible, settled over Robert. It was no longer a ghost story, it was a biography of a broken heart. The phantom music, the empty ballroom, the woman in blue, it all made a dreadful, poignant sense. He was not a man given to sentiment, but he felt a profound, unexpected surge of empathy for this woman, her life and death reduced to a hotel legend, her pain echoing through the decades. That evening, before he left for the airport, he found himself drawn back to the ballroom doors. The corridor was silent. He did not look through the glass. Instead, he stood before the closed doors, his hand resting on the cool, polished wood. He thought of the German doctor's wife, of her betrayal, her final desperate act, her endless lonely vigil in a ballroom of ghosts. He did not speak aloud, but in his mind he formed the words with a clarity and sincerity that surprised him. "I see you," he thought, pouring all his newfound understanding into the silent message. "I heard your music, I know your story, and I am sorry." A warmth bloomed in the center of his chest, a feeling of profound and peaceful resolution that was not his own. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, a final release. The lingering chill that had clung to the corridor since the previous night vanished, replaced by the hotel's normal, neutral temperature. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond evidence, that she was gone. He had not chased her away with fear or skepticism, but had given her what she had needed most, a witness to her truth, an acknowledgement of her pain. The Langham Hotel would always have its history, but one of its saddest, most beautiful ghosts had finally found her peace. Her story heard and honored by a man who had arrived a skeptic and left, forever changed, a believer in the quiet power of a story told and a sorrow finally laid to rest. Some secrets are not buried in stone or earth, but woven into the very fabric of a place, waiting for the right heart to listen, for the right moment to be gently pulled from the loom of time. Ballygally Castle, standing sentinel on the Antrim coast with the Irish Sea crashing at its feet, was a place of such hidden threads. Its whitewashed walls and cheerful flower-filled gardens presented a face of robust hospitality, belying the gentle, persistent sorrow that lingered in its oldest corridors. For Maeve, a genealogist tracing the frayed edges of her own Irish ancestry, the castle was a base for her research. A comfortable room in a landscape that felt strangely like a home she had never known. She was a woman who understood that the past was not a closed book, but a story still being told, its final chapters often written in the silent language of memory and longing. Her room was in the oldest part of the castle, a cozy space with a deep-set window that framed a view of the churning grey-green sea. The first night passed in peaceful, dreamless sleep, the salt-laced air a soothing balm. It was on the second night, in the deep, quiet hours long after midnight, that the silence was broken. A soft, hesitant knocking sounded at her door. Not the sharp rap of a late-night staff member or another guest, but a gentle, almost apologetic tap-tap-tap, like fingertips brushing against the old wood. Maeve stirred from sleep, her heart giving a single, curious thump. She lay still, listening. The knocking came again, a little more insistent this time. Pushing back the covers, she padded to the door and pressed her eye to the peephole, expecting an empty corridor. The hallway was not empty. A woman stood there, her back to the door, gazing out of a small arched window at the end of the passage. She was dressed in a gown of a style Maeve had only seen in history books, a flowing greyish-silver dress from the early 17th century, its fabric seeming to shimmer with a light of its own. Her posture was one of infinite patience and profound sadness, her shoulders slightly stooped as if carrying a great but familiar weight. This was no living guest. A chill, not of fear, but of poignant recognition, traced its way down Maeve's spine. She had read the castle stories, of course. This could only be the ghost of Lady Isabel Shaw, the wife of the castle's builder, said to have fallen, or been pushed, from a high window in a fit of her husband's jealousy, her spirit forever waiting for his return from the sea. Driven by an impulse she did not understand, Maeve slowly, quietly, turned the handle and opened the door. The woman, Lady Shaw, turned at the sound. Her face was pale and beautiful, etched with a loneliness that spanned centuries, but her eyes, when they met Maeve's, held not menace, but a desperate, hopeful plea. She did not speak, did not gesture. She simply looked at Maeve for a long, silent moment, her expression a wordless question. Then she turned and began to glide soundlessly down the corridor, her form seeming to float just above the worn carpet. She did not look back, but it was a clear, unspoken invitation. Follow. Maeve, her historian's soul alight with a thrilling, terrifying curiosity, stepped out of her room and into the corridor. The air grew colder as she followed the shimmering figure, a chill that felt ancient and sorrowful. Lady Shaw led her away from the guest rooms, down a narrow, disused servants' staircase, and into a part of the castle that time seemed to have forgotten. The walls here were rough, unadorned stone, the air thick with the scent of dust and damp. They stopped before a section of wall that looked no different from any other, a seamless expanse of masonry. Lady Shaw raised a translucent hand and pressed it against a specific stone, third from the floor, fifth from the corner. With a soft, grating sound that echoed in the profound silence, a section of the wall, cleverly concealed, swung inward, revealing a dark, hidden space. A wave of stale, yet strangely sweet air, like dried flowers and old parchment, billowed out. Lady Shaw stood at the entrance, her form now faint and trembling, her entire being focused on the darkness within. Her silent plea was now a tangible force, a final, urgent request. Maeve understood. She was being shown something, being trusted with a truth that had been sealed away for generations. Taking a deep breath, she stepped past the ghost and into the hidden room. It was small, little more than an alcove, sealed from light and time. Her eyes, adjusting to the gloom, took in a scene of heartbreaking intimacy. A small wooden cradle stood against one wall, its rockers still. On a simple table beside it lay a collection of tiny, hand-stitched baby clothes, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. And there, tucked into a crevice in the stone, was a small, leather-bound journal. Maeve picked it up with reverent hands. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words were legible. It was not the journal of a murdered wife, but of a grieving mother. Lady Isabel Shaw had not been pushed, she had died in childbirth. The child, a daughter, had survived only a few hours. In his overwhelming grief and shame at having no male heir, Lord Shaw had hidden the evidence of the birth, fabricating the story of his wife's fall to conceal what he saw as a personal failure, the secret of the lost child, and the true, tragic cause of Isabel's death, had been entombed with her in this hidden room. Maeve stood in the silent, dusty space, the journal held gently in her hands, the full weight of the revelation settling over her. The ghost had not been waiting for a husband who had betrayed her, but for someone to find her child, to acknowledge the brief, beautiful life that had been erased from history. She had been waiting for her story to be told truthfully. A profound sense of peace began to fill the small room, a warmth that pushed back the centuries of cold sorrow. Maeve looked back towards the doorway. Lady Shaw was there, but her form was changing. The deep sadness in her eyes was softening, replaced by a look of infinite relief and gratitude. She smiled, a gentle, beautiful expression that seemed to light the dusty alcove. Then she began to fade, her form dissolving into 1,000 points of soft, golden light that swirled for a moment in the air before winking out, one by one. The oppressive sorrow that had clung to the corridor was gone, replaced by a gentle, serene silence. Maeve carefully replaced the journal, a silent promise to honor the secret, to ensure the true story was known to those who cared to listen. She stepped out of the hidden room, and the door swung shut behind her, blending once more into the wall. She made her way back to her own room, the castle feeling lighter around her, as if a great sigh of release had passed through its stones. Lady Shaw's centuries of lonely waiting were over. Her child had been found, her truth revealed. The ghost had found not just a witness, but a keeper of her story, and in that sacred exchange, both the living and the dead had found a measure of peace, bound together by a secret finally, lovingly laid to rest. The dead do not always rest in peace. Sometimes they rest in pieces, their slumber fractured by the clumsy footsteps of the living, their eternal quiet shattered by a single irreverent act. Greyfriars Kirkyard, nestled in the heart of old Edinburgh, was a city of the dead, its tilted, weathered headstones leaning like a crowd. Of silent, stone witnesses under a sky, the colour of lead and sorrow. The air was thick with the damp chill of Scottish autumn and the heavy scent of decayed leaves and cold, wet earth. For the young tourist from America, it was a photo opportunity, a collection of Gothic angles and evocative names to be captured and shared, a thrilling backdrop for his social media feed. The famous stories of the Mackenzie poltergeist, the violent spirit of a 17th-century judge said to haunt the Black Mausoleum, were just that to him. Stories, campfire tales designed to send a pleasant shiver down the spine, not warnings to be heeded. He wandered off the main path, his camera phone held aloft, seeking the perfect, moody shot away from the other visitors. His eyes fell upon a small, sunken grave, its headstone so worn by centuries of rain and wind that the name was nothing more than a ghost of carved letters. It was isolated, forgotten, and perfectly atmospheric. To get a better angle, he stepped over the low, rusted iron fence that surrounded the plot, his heavy boot landing with a crunch on the sunken soil. He didn't see the small, faded plaque asking for respect, nor did he feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, watchful stillness that fell over this corner of the kirkyard. He leaned down, brushing away a handful of dead leaves from the base of the headstone to frame his shot, his touch a casual violation of a boundary that was not merely physical, but spiritual. The moment his fingers made contact with the cold, damp stone, a change occurred. It was not a sound or a sight, but a sensation, a sudden, profound drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the weather. The air around him grew frigid, a pocket of deep winter that seared his lungs and raised goosebumps on his arms. The cheerful, distant chatter of other tourists seemed to be swallowed by this new, localized silence. A deep, instinctual dread, cold and sharp, began to uncoil in the pit of his stomach. He straightened up, suddenly eager to be away from this forgotten plot, his photo forgotten. He quickly stepped back over the fence, but the cold followed him, clinging to his clothes and skin like a shroud. He had only taken a few steps along the gravel path when he felt the first scratch. It was a sharp, stinging sensation on the back of his neck, as if a branch or a thorn had caught him. He swatted at it, his hand coming away clean. He quickened his pace, the kirkyard now feeling less like a historic site and more like a trap. Then came the push. It was not a strong shove, but a firm, unmistakable pressure between his shoulder blades, a hand-shaped force that sent him stumbling forward, his heart leaping into his throat. He whirled around, his breath pluming in the freezing air, but the path behind him was empty. The other visitors were still distant specks, no one near enough to have touched him. Panic, cold and absolute, began to set in. He started to jog, desperate to reach the kirkyard gates and the sane, modern world beyond. As he ran, the phenomena intensified. Invisible fingers tugged at his jacket, pulling him off balance. Sharp, painful scratches appeared on his arms, etching thin, red lines through his sleeves as if clawed by an unseen hand. He was buffeted by unseen forces, pushed and pulled as he staggered through the labyrinth of graves, the names on the headstones now seeming like a jury of the dead, silently condemning his trespass. The stories of the Mackenzie poltergeist were no longer campfire tales, they were a brutal physical reality, and he was its sole terrified focus. This was not a ghost that moaned or rattled chains, it was an entity of pure aggressive malice, and it had him in its sights. His frantic, stumbling run brought him, as if by some dark design, to the foot of the black mausoleum. The tomb was a brooding, solid structure of dark stone, its iron gate ajar, the darkness within seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy. It was the epicenter of the haunting, the lair of the beast he had unwittingly awakened. He collapsed to his knees on the wet gravel before it, his body trembling uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The scratches on his arms stung, the memory of the pushes and tugs a fresh horror in his mind. He understood, with a clarity born of pure terror, what he had to do. He bowed his head, the words tumbling from his lips in a frantic, broken whisper. "I'm sorry," he choked out. The apology meant for the forgotten grave, for the kirkyard, for the angry, restless spirit that held him in its grip. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean any disrespect. I was wrong. Please, please, just stop." The change was instantaneous. The oppressive, aggressive cold lifted, vanishing as if a switch had been thrown. The sensation of being watched, of being hunted, dissipated into the damp, normal air of the afternoon. The stinging on his arms ceased. He remained on his knees for a long moment, his head bowed, tears of relief and shame mixing with the fine, cold mist that had begun to fall. The kirkyard was just a kirkyard again, silent and still, but no longer hostile. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. He did not look back at the black mausoleum as he walked, slowly and deliberately, towards the gate. He passed other tourists entering, their faces bright with curiosity, and he felt a world apart from them, a veteran of a war they could not conceive of. He stepped out onto the cobbled street, the sounds of the city a jarring, welcome cacophony. But the peace of the living world could not fully reach him. The memory of the invisible claws, the phantom shoves, and the crushing, intelligent hatred of the poltergeist was etched into his nerves as deeply as the scratches had been on his skin. He had apologized and the activity had stopped, but the terror remained, a permanent resident in his mind. He had learned a brutal lesson in the old kirkyard. Some lines are not meant to be crossed, and the dead guard their silence with a fury that the living can scarcely comprehend. There is a darkness that is more than the mere absence of light. It is a tangible, breathing entity, a weight of earth and time that presses in from all sides. A silence so profound it feels like a physical pressure on the eardrums. The Hellfire Caves, carved deep into the chalk hills of West Wickham, were the very definition of such darkness. To the three young men who paid their entrance fee with boisterous laughter and jostling elbows, it was a lark, a Saturday afternoon adventure fueled by pints and a shared derisive skepticism for the occult. They were modern, rational creatures, their world lit by screens and explained by science, and the tales of the 18th century Hellfire Club, of wealthy, decadent men performing blasphemous rituals in these very tunnels, were nothing more than a historical joke, a spooky story to mock in the safety of a well-lit pub. The air that met them at the mouth of the cave was cold and damp, carrying the scent of wet chalk and something older, a faint mineral tang of deep earth. They descended, their footsteps echoing in the narrow, man-made passage, their voices loud and jarring in the enclosed space. They laughed as they passed the inscriptions and statues, making crude jokes about the Medmenham monks and their secret rites. They mocked the idea of summoning spirits, of pacts with dark forces, their bravado a flimsy shield against the creeping, subconscious unease that the descending darkness inevitably brought. The further they went from the entrance, the more the world above seemed to fade, until it felt like a distant, half-remembered dream. The electric lights strung along the ceiling did little to push back the oppressive gloom. They only created pools of weak, yellow illumination, separated by stretches of deep, swallowing shadow. It was in one of these shadowy stretches, in a chamber known as the banqueting hall, that the mood began to curdle. The laughter of the group, once so forceful, began to sound thin and hollow, swallowed by the immense, silent weight of the hill above them. The air grew colder, the dampness seeming to seep through their jackets and into their bones. The one named Liam, usually the loudest of the three, fell silent. He had strayed a few steps ahead of his friends, peering into a side tunnel that branched off into utter blackness. A movement caught his eye, a flicker of deeper darkness at the very edge of his vision. He turned his head, and his blood ran cold. Standing in the mouth of the side tunnel was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, shrouded in a heavy, dark, hooded robe that obscured its face entirely. It was utterly still, a statue of woven shadow, but Liam felt its attention like a physical touch, a cold, intelligent gaze fixed directly upon him. From the darkness behind the figure, a sound began to emanate. It was a low, rhythmic chanting, a guttural, monotonous incantation, in a language he did not recognize. The words were not loud, but they seemed to vibrate through the chalk walls and into the marrow of his bones, a primitive, unsettling cadence that spoke of things older than reason, older than light. A primal fear, cold and absolute, seized Liam. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. "Guys," he whispered, his voice a ragged thread of sound. He turned to his friends, expecting to see shared terror on their faces, ready to bolt back towards the distant promise of the exit. But they were not looking at him. They were not looking at anything. Tom and Ben stood side by side in the center of the banqueting hall, their bodies rigid, their faces utterly blank. Their eyes were open, but they were vacant, their pupils wide and dark, reflecting the weak electric light with a glassy, unseeing sheen. They were perfectly still, not breathing, as if frozen in time. They were in a trance, their minds and spirits. Somewhere far away, held captive by the same ancient power that had manifested the hooded figure. The mocking laughter, the rational skepticism, it had all been stripped away, leaving them vulnerable, empty vessels in the face of a force they had been too arrogant to respect. The chanting from the side tunnel grew slightly louder, more insistent. The hooded figure had not moved, but its presence was a vortex, pulling at the very air in the chamber. Liam knew, with a certainty that bypassed thought, that if he did not get his friends out now, they would be lost. He would be lost. He fought against the paralyzing terror that threatened to lock his own limbs, forcing his body to move. He rushed forward, grabbing Tom and then Ben by their arms. Their flesh was cold and unresponsive. He shook them, his voice breaking as he pleaded with them to wake up, to run. There was no recognition in their eyes, no flicker of consciousness. Putting an arm around each of them, he began to half-drag, half-carry them back the way they had come, away from the hooded sentinel and its hypnotic chant. It was a desperate, clumsy retreat. Their dead weight was immense, and every shadow seemed to writhe with menace. He did not look back, but he could feel the figure's gaze on his back, a cold spot between his shoulder blades. The chanting followed them, echoing down the tunnel, a spectral leash that seemed to stretch and tighten with every step. He focused only on the distant, growing speck of daylight, a promise of salvation that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He burst out of the cave entrance into the shock of the afternoon sun, dragging his catatonic friends with him. He collapsed onto the grass, gasping great, ragged sobs of relief and terror, his friends slumping beside him like discarded dolls. The warm, living air, the sound of birdsong, the solid reality of the world, it was all a brutal, wonderful contrast to the consuming darkness they had just escaped. Slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, Tom and Ben began to stir. They blinked, confused and disoriented, their memories of the cave a blur of fear and strange sounds. They had no recollection of the hooded figure or the chanting, only a profound, lingering sense of dread. Liam said nothing as they drove home in a thick, shaken silence. There were no jokes, no attempts to rationalize what had happened. The experience was a brand seared into his soul. He had looked into the abyss of the occult, and it had looked back, holding his friends in its thrall. He had vowed, in that moment of sheer terror, never to mock that which he did not understand. The darkness in the Hellfire Caves was not a story, it was a presence, and their arrogant laughter had been an invitation it had been all too willing to accept. He knew he would never set foot in such a place again. The memory of the hooded figure and the sound of that ancient guttural chant, a permanent warning etched into his mind. There is a sadness that is not born of violence or betrayal, but of a quieter, more profound loss, the erosion of hope, the fading of a light that once promised a better world. This was the sorrow that clung to the Todmorden Unitarian Church, a solid, unassuming building of Yorkshire stone that stood as a monument to a creed of radical tolerance in a world that had not always been ready to listen. For Ilara, a local woman who had found her own faith tested by life's relentless tides, the church was not a place of haunted reputation, but a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, its simple pews and clear glass windows offering a refuge from the noise of the modern world. She attended the Sunday service out of habit and a faint, lingering hope, seeking not a ghost, but a glimmer of the peace that seemed to have leached from her own spirit. The congregation was small, a handful of elderly faces whose faith seemed as weathered and enduring as the stone walls. The morning light streamed through the plain windows, illuminating dust motes, dancing in the still air like forgotten prayers. The minister's words were gentle, speaking of compassion and understanding, of a God who embraced all, an echo of the progressive, inclusive theology the church had been founded upon centuries before. But as the service progressed, Ilara found herself unable to focus on the sermon. A heavy, melancholic weight began to settle upon her, a feeling so vast and impersonal it could not be her own. It was the grief of the building itself, the accumulated sorrow of promises made in a more hopeful time, now faded by disillusion and the slow, steady march of apathy. It was the sadness of a beautiful idea whose time had not yet come and might never come. Tears she did not understand welled in her eyes, a profound, desolate ache blooming in her chest. She bowed her head, trying to shield herself from the overwhelming emotion, and when she looked up, she saw him. He was standing in the shadows of the small apse beside the simple wooden pulpit, a man dressed in the severe, dark clothing of an 18th century nonconformist minister. His face was pale and lined with care, but his eyes held a deep, unwavering kindness. He was not a solid figure, but a shimmering apparition woven from memory and the church's own longing, a faint luminescence outlining his form against the dark wood. Ilara knew, without knowing how she knew, that this was the ghost of a former minister, a man who had once stood in that very pulpit and preached a gospel of breathtaking tolerance, of universal salvation, of a God whose love knew no bounds of creed or sin, a dangerous, radical notion in its day. The spectral minister was not looking at the small modern congregation. His gaze was turned inward, fixed on some private, eternal sorrow. She felt his heart break as if it were her own, the frustration of fighting a tide of bigotry, the pain of seeing his message of love met with scorn and closed minds, the lonely burden of holding a light that so few seemed willing to see. His sadness was not for himself, but for the world's refusal to be saved by the simple, profound power of unconditional love. It was this shared grief, this echo of a beautiful, failed dream that had washed over her, resonating with the hidden disappointments in her own soul. As she watched, the ghostly minister slowly turned his head. His sorrowful eyes met hers across the quiet space of the church. In that moment, there was no fear, only a deep, profound connection, a recognition of a shared weariness. Then, a gentle smile touched his translucent lips. He raised a hand, not in a gesture of preaching, but of blessing. His palm was turned towards her, and a wave of palpable, warm peace emanated from him, a soft golden light that seemed to flow across the pews and envelop her. The crushing weight of sadness lifted from her soul as if it had never been. The desolate ache in her chest dissolved, replaced by a gentle, pervasive warmth. The tears on her cheeks were no longer tears of sorrow, but of release. The minister's blessing was not a dismissal of the world's pain, but an affirmation that the light he had carried, the message of love, was still valid, still potent, even in its seeming failure. It was a transfer of grace, a passing of the torch from a ghost who had carried it for centuries to a living soul who needed to feel its warmth. The service ended with a final hymn, the voices of the small congregation rising, thin but sincere, into the rafters. Ilara stood with the others, but she felt transformed. She looked back towards the apse. The ghost of the minister was gone, the shadows once again just shadows. But the peace he had bestowed remained, a solid, comforting presence within her, a light kindled in the dark. She walked out of the church into the cool Yorkshire air, the world outside looking brighter, the colours more vivid. The ghost of Todmorden Unitarian Church had not been a spectre of terror, but a spirit of solace. He had taken her, sorrow, her own private burden of disillusionment, and had blessed it, transforming it into a quiet, resilient hope. The church held not a haunting, but a healing, and she carried its gentle, luminous gift with her as she stepped back into the world, her soul lighter, her heart strangely, wonderfully, mended. Some stones do not merely mark a place. They are a gateway, a physical anchor for forces that hum just beyond the veil of the seen world. Swinside Circle, nestled in a silent Cumbrian valley, was such a place. The 55 gritstone sentinels stood in a perfect ring, their backs to the rolling fells, their ancient, lichen-crusted faces turned inward towards a secret the land had long since forgotten. For Rhys, a druid whose faith was written in the turning of the seasons and the language of the earth, the circle was not a ruin, but a living temple. He had come alone, as he did each year, to greet the winter solstice dawn, to feel the world hold its breath at the tipping point of the year, and to perform the simple ancient rites that honored the sleeping land and the promise of its return. He arrived in the deep pre-dawn darkness, the frost crunching under his boots, his breath pluming in the still frigid air. The only light came from the hard, cold glitter of stars strewn across a velvet sky, and the sliver of a waning moon that cast the circle in a ghostly silver monochrome. The silence was absolute, a presence in itself, deeper than mere quiet. As he stepped across the invisible threshold into the ring, the air changed. It grew thicker, charged with a subtle energy that raised the fine hairs on his arms and made the back of his neck prickle. This was the Newman of the place, the ancient spirit of the circle, awake and waiting. He could feel it, a low, resonant hum in the earth beneath his feet, a patient, watchful intelligence that had witnessed countless turns of the great wheel. He closed his eyes, stretching out his senses, and the impressions came. To him, not as visions but as feelings. The joy of harvest festivals, the solemnity of burials, the desperate pleas for sun and rain, the blood of sacrifices offered to gods whose names were now dust. The stones remembered it all, holding the echoes of 4,000 years of faith and fear in their unyielding hearts. He built a small, careful fire in the very center of the circle, the flames a brave, dancing counterpoint to the consuming darkness. As he began the ritual, chanting the old words in a low, rhythmic murmur, the circle seemed to lean in, listening. The firelight cast the standing stones into a dance of light and shadow, their long, distorted silhouettes stretching and contracting like giants stirring from a long slumber. And then he saw them, not with his eyes, but in the periphery of his vision, in the spaces between the stones, shadows that were not cast by the fire. They moved with a fluid, graceful purpose, tall and indistinct, weaving through the monoliths in a pattern that was both chaotic and deeply ordered. They were the shadows of the ancient ones, the builders and the worshippers, their forms preserved in the spiritual memory of the site, dancing their timeless spectral dance to a music only they could hear. They did not acknowledge him, lost in their own eternal ceremony, but their presence was a blessing, an affirmation that the old ways were not dead, only sleeping. As the first, faint hint of grey began to bleed into the eastern sky, Rhys completed the final invocation. He raised his arms, his voice a clear carrying note in the frozen air, calling to the sun to return, to the light to banish the long night. A profound sense of connection washed over him, a feeling of being a single small link in a chain of tradition that stretched back into the deep, misty past and forward into an unknowable future. He was not Rhys, the solitary druid. He was a part of the circle, a part of the land, a part of the turning year. In that moment, the boundaries between himself, the stones, and the ancient spirits dissolved into a unified, thrumming whole. The sun broke the horizon, a sliver of molten gold that painted the undersides of the clouds in fiery hues. The long night was over. The light, weak but triumphant, poured into the valley, striking the tallest stone and setting its wet surface ablaze. The shadows of the dancers vanished, their ceremony complete, retreating back into the memory of the stone. The oppressive, ancient presence softened, becoming once more a gentle background hum. The ritual was over. The connection remained, a warm, steady glow in his chest, but the intense, shared consciousness of the moment began to fade, leaving him grounded, whole, and filled with a quiet, profound peace. He extinguished his fire, scattering the ashes and leaving no trace of his passage. As he prepared to leave, a group of early morning hikers appeared on the crest of the nearby fell, their brightly colored jackets a jarring note in the ancient landscape. He watched them for a moment, their laughter carrying on the still air as they pointed towards the circle, their intention to explore it clear. A protective instinct, sharp and fierce, rose within him. This was not a playground or a photo opportunity. He walked to meet them as they descended, his staff in his hand, his face solemn. "This is a sacred place," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying an authority that made them pause. "The stones have stood for millennia. They hold more than you can see. Walk among them if you must, but do so with respect. Touch gently, speak softly, take nothing but photographs, leave nothing but footprints. The old spirits do not take kindly to disrespect, and their memory is long." The hikers, chastened by his intensity, nodded, their boisterous mood subdued. They entered the circle with a new, quiet reverence. Rhys watched them for a moment before turning away, the weight of his role as a guardian settling on his shoulders. He felt connected to the past, blessed by the spirits, but also burdened with a warning for the present. The circle was a bridge, and it was his duty to ensure that those who crossed it did so with the humility the ancient watchful stones deserved. There is a wood that does not belong to the world of sun and soil, a place where the very laws of nature seem to have been twisted by an older, more dreamlike logic. Wistman's Wood, a stunted, ancient oak forest clinging to a valley on Dartmoor, was such a place. The trees themselves were not tall and majestic, but low, gnarled and impossibly old, their branches a tangled, writhing mass of grey wood covered in a thick, spongy pelt of moss and lichen. They grew from a chaotic floor of granite boulders, their roots snaking over the stone like the veins of some slumbering, petrified giant. The air within the wood was perpetually cool and damp, thick with the scent of peat, decay, and the profound, watchful silence of a realm untouched by time. For the hiker, who left the sun-drenched moor and stepped into its twilight realm, it was like passing through a membrane into another world entirely, a world that remembered a time when England was a wild, untamed wilderness, and magic was not just a story, but a force in the blood of the land. He had planned a straightforward traverse, his map marking a clear path through the strange, stunted forest. But the wood had its own intentions. The moment he passed the first, moss-shrouded oaks, the path seemed to dissolve, swallowed by the chaotic jumble of boulders and the low-hanging skeletal branches that reached for him with the slow, patient intent of old men. The light, so bright on the open moor, became a filtered submarine green, dappled and deceptive. A profound disorientation set in almost immediately. North, south, east and west lost all meaning. The sun was a memory, its position obscured by the dense, tangled canopy. Every twisted tree looked the same, every mossy boulder a repetition of the last. He tried to retrace his steps, but the wood seemed to have shifted behind him, closing off his escape, herding him deeper into its heart. The cheerful chirp of moorland birds was gone, replaced by a heavy, listening silence broken only by the soft squelch of his boots in the damp moss and the frantic, accelerating beat of his own heart. It was in this state of rising panic that he saw the first hound, a movement in the periphery of his vision, a flicker of grey and white slipping between two gnarled trunks. He turned his head, expecting to see a stray dog from a nearby farm, but there was nothing there. Then he saw another, this one closer. A large spectral dog with a coat the colour of mist and eyes that glowed with a faint, phosphorescent green. It was there for a heartbeat, its form semi-transparent, its paws making no sound on the soft ground, and then it was gone. More followed. Phantom hounds, silent and swift, began to flit through the trees around him, their shapes shimmering in and out of existence. They did not approach him, did not growl or bare their teeth. They simply ran. A silent, ghostly pack weaving through the ancient wood, their presence a confirmation that he had strayed far from the rational world and into a place where the legends of the wild hunt and the wished hounds of Dartmoor were not myth, but a living, breathing reality. A cold dread, colder than the wood's natural chill, seeped into his bones. He was lost, truly and utterly lost, in a realm that was not his own. He stumbled forward, his breathing ragged, the phantom hounds keeping pace with him just out of clear sight, their silent pursuit more terrifying than any audible threat. Just as despair began to tighten its grip on his throat, his eyes fell upon a path he had not seen before. It was not a path of trodden earth, but a subtle, almost imperceptible parting in the moss and the low-hanging branches. It was clearer, somehow, than the surrounding. Gloom, a ribbon of slightly brighter air that wound its way through the chaotic tangle of stone and root. It felt ancient, a way made not by human feet, but by the passage of something else, something that belonged here. It was a spirit path, a road for the unseen, and it was his only hope. He did not question the instinct that told him to follow it. He stepped onto the faint trail, and immediately the oppressive, disorienting atmosphere of the wood lessened. The phantom hounds ceased their silent running, fading back into the mist from which they had come. The path led him on a winding, gentle route, guiding his feet over the most stable rocks, leading him under arches of moss-furred branches that felt like gateways. The journey along the spirit path was a blur of timeless wonder. The air grew soft and hazy, the colors of the moss and lichen deepening to impossible emeralds and golds. He felt a profound sense of peace, of being a guest in a sacred, hidden realm where time held no sway. He was not walking through a wood, he was walking through a memory of the world, a pocket of primeval England that had refused to fade. He did not know how long he walked the spirit path, but eventually the light ahead began to change, growing brighter, harsher. The twisted oaks began to thin, their stunted forms giving way to the familiar wind-swept grasses of the open moor. He took one last step and emerged from the edge of the wood, blinking in the brilliant late-afternoon sunlight. He turned and looked back. Wisman's Wood sat silent and impenetrable in its valley, its secrets once again locked away behind a wall of gnarled branches and deep shadow. The disorientation was gone, replaced by the solid, reassuring knowledge of where he was. But he was not the same man who had entered. The memory of the phantom hounds and the gentle guidance of the spirit path were etched into his soul, not as a terror, but as a precious, bewildering gift. He had been granted a glimpse into a timeless realm, a world of old magic and older spirits, and he carried the memory of it with him as he walked away, a solitary figure on the vast, empty moor, forever haunted by the beautiful, impossible truth of the wood that did not belong to his world. Some ruins do not whisper of gentle decline, but of violent rupture, their broken stones a testament to a sanctity violated and a peace deliberately shattered. The old church of St. Mary's at Clophill stood on its lonely Bedfordshire hill, not as a picturesque relic, but as a scar upon the landscape, its nave open to the sky, its tower a broken tooth against the scudding clouds. For the photographer who trudged up the grassy path, his heavy bag of equipment a familiar weight, it was this raw, untamed quality that drew him. He sought not the clean lines of a preserved monument, but the stark, emotional power of decay, the stories that weather and vandalism had etched into the crumbling flint and mortar. The air was still and heavy, the only sounds the whisper of the wind through the empty window frames and the distant bleating of sheep, sounds that seemed only to accentuate the profound silence clinging to the hollowed-out shell. He set up his tripod in the nave, where the altar would have once stood, and began his work. The light was perfect, a low, golden afternoon sun that cast long, dramatic shadows through the skeletal ribs of the walls. He focused his lens on the intricate tracery of a surviving window, its stone lacework silhouetted against the bright sky. It was as he waited for the light to shift that he saw the first movement. A flicker of white in the deep shadows of the chancel, a fleeting impression of a figure in a long, pale garment that was there, and then gone. A trick of the light and his own imagination, he told himself. He adjusted his settings, his professional focus reasserting itself. But the sense of being watched, of not being alone in the open ruin, persisted, a subtle pressure at the edge of his awareness. He moved to capture the exterior from a new angle, framing the broken tower against a bank of bruised purple clouds. As he peered through the viewfinder, something else caught his eye. A light, a soft, golden glow emanating from one of the narrow slit windows high up in the ruined tower. It was not the reflection of the setting sun. The light was too steady, too contained, and it came from a part of the structure that was meant to be a dark, empty shell, inaccessible and sealed for decades. He stared, his finger pausing over the shutter button. The light pulsed gently, like a candle flame in a draught. And for a moment he thought he saw a dark shape pass in front of it, a silhouette against the impossible glow. He quickly took the shot, the camera's click unnaturally loud in the stillness, but when he looked up with his naked eye, the tower was dark again, just a jagged outline against the darkening sky. A cold prickle, entirely separate from the evening chill, traced its way down his spine. Packing up his gear as dusk began to bleed into the landscape, he felt a profound unease, a sense that the ruin was not as empty as it appeared. He decided to stop at the pub in the village at the foot of the hill, seeking the warmth of electric light and human voices. Over a pint of bitter, he fell into conversation with the publican, a man with the calm, settled air of someone who has lived his whole life in the shadow of the hill. The photographer mentioned the strange light in the tower, the fleeting figure in white. The publican's genial expression grew solemn. He nodded slowly, as if confirming a dreaded suspicion. "Aye, you've seen them," he said, his voice low. "The old church, it's had a troubled time of it. After it was deconsecrated, it became a target. Not for vandals at first, but for something darker." He leaned closer, the smell of hops and wood smoke clinging to him. In the 60 seconds, this was a place for them, the Satanists they'd break in, hold. Their black masses here, desecrate the place. They believed the hill was a nexus of power, but they twisted it. They invited something in, something that liked the taste of that violation. The words landed with the weight of a tombstone. The photographer's artistic fascination curdled into a deep, visceral revulsion. The beautiful decay he had been capturing was not natural. It was the aftermath of a spiritual poison. The pale figure was not a benign ghost, but a relic of that sacrilege, and the light in the tower a beacon for things that had no business in a place that was once God's house. A profound sense of dread settled over him, the pint glass suddenly cold in his hand. He left the pub and, driven by a compulsion he could not name, found himself walking back up the hill towards the church. The moon had risen, a cold, bone-white sliver that cast the ruin in a monochrome, eerie light. He stood at the edge of the churchyard, the dark outline of the broken church looming before him. The malevolent presence he now knew of should have felt overwhelming, a foulness seeping from the stones. But as he stood there, a strange thing happened. A different sensation began to emanate from the ruin, a feeling that was quiet, deep, and immensely powerful. It was not the aggressive sanctity of a bustling modern church, but the patient, enduring strength of a foundation that had been laid in true faith centuries ago. It was a protective presence, the ghost of the church's original sanctity, a force that had withstood the violation and remained, a bastion against the darkness that had been invited in. It did not attack the foulness, it simply held it at bay, containing it within the broken walls, refusing to let its poison seep into the land beyond. The photographer felt a profound sense of safety, a calm that was as deep and old as the hills themselves. The church was a ruin, its body broken, but its soul, its true consecrated heart, was unbroken. It was still fighting its long, silent war, and standing in its shadow, he felt not like a witness to decay, but a guest in a sanctuary that, even in its death, knew how to protect its own. There is a terror that does not wait for darkness, a dread that lives in the very air, in the twisted shapes of the trees, in the suffocating silence that is not silent at all. The woods did not have an official name on any map, but everyone knew them as the Screaming Woods. They were a dense, brooding tangle of pine and oak on the edge of the countryside, a place where the sunlight seemed to die before it could reach the ground, and where local legend spoke of lost travelers, of voices that mimicked your own, and of screams that echoed from no human throat. For Liam and Chloe, it was a dare, a foolish pact made after one too many drinks, a test of their courage and their relatively new relationship. They stood at the tree line, the cheerful, sun-drenched field at their backs, feeling a million miles away from the wall of shadows that stood before them. The air was still and unnaturally quiet, the birdsong from the open land ceasing abruptly at the wood's edge, as if an invisible barrier separated the living world from this one. Hand in hand, their bravado already thinning, they stepped across the threshold. The change was immediate and profound. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, the warm summer day replaced by a clammy, persistent chill. The light turned a sickly, green-tinged grey, filtered through a dense canopy that choked out the sky. The path, barely visible, was a narrow ribbon of soft, decaying leaves that muffled their footsteps, making their progress feel like a trespass in a silent cathedral. The silence, however, was a lie. It was a canvas upon which other, more unsettling sounds were soon painted. At first it was a distant, faint cry, like a fox or a distressed bird. But as they ventured deeper, the sounds grew closer, more defined. It was a scream, a raw human sound of pure, unadulterated terror, ripped from a throat and left to hang in the stagnant air. It came from their left, then moments later, from directly behind them, a phantom sound with no source, no echo, just a single piercing note of agony that faded as quickly as it came. Liam squeezed Chloe's hand, his own palm slick with sweat. "Just the wind," he whispered, his voice a frail, unconvincing thing in the oppressive stillness. But there was no wind. The leaves on the trees were motionless. Chloe didn't answer, her eyes wide, scanning the tangled undergrowth. That's when she saw the shadows move, not the passive, shifting patterns of light and dark, but shapes that detached themselves from the trunks, tall and unnaturally slender, that slid between the trees just at the edge of their vision. They were man-like but wrong, their movements a fluid, silent glide that was utterly alien. One moment a shadow would be there, a dark sentinel watching them pass. The next it would be gone, only to reappear further ahead, as if herding them, guiding them deeper into the heart of the woods. The screaming began in earnest then, no longer a single isolated event, but a chorus. It was a cacophony of despair. Men, women, and even the high, terrified wails of children, a symphony of lost souls that seemed to come from every direction at once. The sounds overlapped, layered over one another, a relentless auditory assault that shredded their nerves and filled the air with invisible psychic pain. They broke into a run, their earlier caution abandoned, their only goal to escape the suffocating horror of the sound. But the woods themselves seemed to conspire against them. Low-hanging branches snatched at their clothes like grasping fingers, and thick roots seemed to rise from the ground to trip them. The path vanished, swallowed by ferns and brambles, leaving them crashing blindly through the undergrowth. They ran hand in hand, their fingers locked together in a white-knuckled grip that was their only anchor to reality. The feeling of being chased was now a physical certainty, a pressure at their backs, a cold breath on their necks. They could hear the rustle of pursuit in the dry leaves, a sound that kept pace with them, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, sometimes so close it seemed to be just over their shoulders. They didn't dare look back. To look back was to see what was hunting them, and some deep primal instinct told them that to see it was to be lost forever. Their lungs burned, their hearts hammered against their ribs, and the phantom screams felt as if they were being torn from their own throats. Just as a cold, despairing certainty that they would run forever in this green-tinged hell began to take root, a sliver of blinding golden light appeared through the trees ahead. They surged towards it, their bodies fueled by a final, desperate burst of adrenaline. They burst out of the tree line, stumbling and falling onto the soft, sun-warmed grass of the field they had left behind. They lay there, gasping, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. The normal, blessed sounds of the countryside, the buzz of insects, the distant lowing of a cow, a symphony of sanity after the wood's horrific chorus. The phantom screams were gone, the chasing presence had not followed them into the light. They were safe. They lay side by side in the grass, their hands still tightly clasped, their terror slowly receding, replaced by a shaky, profound relief and a new, unbreakable bond forged in the shared crucible of a fear so absolute it had stripped them down to their rawest, most human selves. They were terrified, but they were united, their escape from the screaming woods a secret they would carry together for the rest of their lives. There is a music that is not made for mortal ears, a harmony woven from silence and memory, a melody that lingers in the stones of a place long after the last note has faded from the air. York Minster, that colossal testament to faith and human ambition, held such music in its very bones. Its vast, vaulted ceiling was a frozen symphony in stone, its stained glass windows a silent chorus of colored light. For Ilara, a chorister whose life was a dedication to sacred song, the minster was not just a cathedral, it was the ultimate instrument, a vessel of such profound acoustics that to sing within its hallowed space was to feel one's own voice become a part of something eternal, something divine. She had been granted a rare privilege, the key to a side door, allowing her to practice alone in the immense empty nave after official hours, when the tourists had departed and the great building belonged once more to God and the echoes. Tonight she worked on a particularly complex piece, a modern composition that demanded precision and emotional depth. The final, lingering note of a phrase hung in the still, cool air, and in the resonant silence that followed, she heard it. Another voice. It was faint, a thread of sound so delicate it might have been a trick of the minster's famous echo, but it was not. It was a clear, pure tenor, harmonizing perfectly with the chord she had just sung, a ghostly counterpoint that faded almost as soon as it was born. She stood frozen, her sheet music forgotten in her hands, her heart beating a swift, curious rhythm. She was utterly alone. The security guards made their rounds on a different schedule, and the great space was empty save for the forest of pillars and the distant, dim glow of the eternal light above the high altar. She tried the phrase again, her voice stronger this time, more deliberate. She held the final note, and again, as it began to decay into silence, the harmony returned. It was closer now, richer, the voice of a trained singer, a man, weaving around her own melody with an instinctive, flawless grace. It was a sound from another time, a voice that had not been shaped by modern technique, but by the simpler, purer discipline of the medieval choir. A shiver, not of fear, but of awe, traced its way down her spine. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the deep shadows of the side aisles, the choir stalls, the distant presbytery. And then she saw him. He was standing in the entrance to the chapter house, a figure woven from moonlight and shadow. He was clad in the rough, dark robes of a Benedictine monk, a cowl shadowing his face, but his hands were clasped before him, pale and still. He was semi-transparent, his form shimmering with a soft, internal luminescence, a patch of concentrated history made visible. He made no sound, offered no threat. He simply stood, a silent sentinel from the minster's distant past, and Ilara knew with a certainty that bypassed logic that it was his voice she had heard, his spirit still dedicated to the music that had been his life's prayer. For a long moment they remained in that silent communion, the living chorister and the ghostly monk. Then he moved. He did not walk, but seemed to glide, his form flowing soundlessly across the vast stone floor. He was not heading for the door, but deeper into the cathedral, towards the ancient crypt. Compelled by a force she did not understand, Ilara followed, her footsteps a soft, solitary counterpoint to his ethereal passage. He led her down a narrow, spiraling staircase, into the older Gangdi part of the minster, the air growing colder and smelling of damp earth and immovable time. He stopped before a section of the crypt wall that seemed no different from any other, an expanse of rough Norman stonework. He raised a translucent hand and pointed to a specific stone, its surface slightly more worn than its neighbors. Ilara approached, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She ran her fingers over the stone, feeling the cool, gritty surface. There was a slight give. Pushing with more pressure, she felt a soft click, and a small concealed compartment, no larger than a book, swung inward. Inside, protected from the centuries, lay a sheaf of vellum, brittle and brown with age. It was a musical score, the notes hand-drawn in faded ink, the staff lines ruled with painstaking care. It was a piece of music, a hymn of praise, forgotten by time, its composer anonymous, its melody silenced for hundreds of years. The monk's form seemed to brighten, a wave of palpable joy and relief emanating from him. This was his purpose. This was the unfinished business that had held him here. Not a curse or a tragedy, but a song, a beautiful, lost piece of the minster's soul, waiting to be found, waiting to be sung. She took the score with reverent hands, the ghost watching her, his cowled head inclined in what she felt was a gesture of profound gratitude. As she held the ancient vellum, his form began to fade, the luminescence that composed him softening, dissolving like mist in a sudden sunbeam. He did not vanish with a pop or a wisp, but simply unwound, his presence flowing back into the stones from which it had briefly emerged, his long vigil finally over. Ilara was left alone in the silent crypt, the forgotten score held gently in her hands. The next day, after careful consultation with the minster's music director and a musicologist, the score was authenticated. It was a unique, previously unknown 14th century hymn. That Sunday, as part of the choral evensong, Ilara stood with the choir in the great stall. As the organ's first notes of the newly discovered hymn filled the vast space, she added her voice to the others. The ancient melody, simple and soaring, rose into the vaulted ceiling, a sound that had not been heard in over 600 years. As she sang, she felt not the weight of history, but an incredible, buoyant lightness, a sense of pure, unadulterated joy that was not her own. It was his joy, the monk's delight, a final, ecstatic release that resonated in the very air, a ghostly amen to a prayer finally, beautifully completed. The music was no longer lost, it was home, and the spirit of the monk who had guarded it could finally rest, his harmony restored to the eternal symphony of the minster. There are places where the land itself holds a memory older than stone, a consciousness that watches from the mist and the heather, a guardian spirit woven from the very fabric of the wild. Bodmin Moor was such a place, a vast rolling expanse of granite tors and treacherous mires under a sky that could turn from benevolent blue to brooding grey in the space of a single breath. To Evan, a farmer whose family had worked the land at the moor's edge for 5 generations, it was not a picturesque landscape, but a demanding partner, a living entity that gave sustenance, but demanded respect in return. He knew its moods, its secret paths, and its legends, the most famous of which was the Beast of Bodmin, a phantom black cat said to stalk the lonely lanes and prey on livestock. For Evan, it was a story to keep tourists entertained and children indoors after dark, until the night it ceased to be a story. It was a night of clinging fog, the kind that muffled sound and reduced the world to a radius of a few feet around the farmhouse. Evan was making his final rounds, checking on the pregnant ewes in the lower pasture, when a sound cut through the damp silence, a sharp, terrified bleat from the direction of the high moor, followed by a deep, guttural snarl that was unlike any animal he knew. It was a sound of pure primal power that vibrated through the ground and up through the soles of his boots, raising the hairs on the back of his neck. His blood ran cold. A ewe was missing from the count, a young one due to lamb any day. Cursing, he fetched his powerful torch and his old rifle, more for the weight of it in his hands than any real belief it would be needed against a folk tale. He crossed the stone wall that marked the boundary of his managed land and stepped onto the true moor. The fog was thicker here, a swirling pearlescent wall that swallowed the beam of his torch after. Only a few yards. The world vanished, leaving only the feel of springy turf underfoot and the oppressive wet silence. He followed the faint, panicked trail of the ewe, his senses stretched taut, listening for any sound beyond the frantic thumping of his own heart. The stories of the beast, of its glowing eyes and impossible size, crowded into his mind, but he pushed them back. This was his land, his responsibility. He crested a small rise, and the fog parted for a moment, revealing a shallow basin below, and there it was. A shape, massive and black, crouched over a huddled white form. It was larger than any dog, its shoulders powerful and bunched, its coat a void of darkness that seemed to drink the light. For a heart-stopping second, he saw the profile of a great cat, a panther-like head, and eyes that reflected his torchlight, not with the flat shine of an animal, but with a cold, ancient intelligence. He froze, his finger tightening on the trigger of the rifle. The beast of Bodmin was real, and it had his ewe, but it was not feeding, it was not attacking. As Evan watched, his breath held tight in his chest. The great black shape shifted. It was standing guard, its body positioned between the terrified, unharmed ewe and a deeper patch of shadow from which a low, menacing growl emanated. A sound of real earthly danger, perhaps a feral dog or a sick fox. The beast was not the predator, it was the protector. In that moment of stunning clarity, Evan understood. The legend was a shield, a story told to keep people away from the moor's true fragile heart. This was no flesh-and-blood animal, but something far older, a spirit of the place, a guardian that had taken this form to watch over the land and its creatures. The lost ewe had simply strayed into a place of real danger, and the guardian had intervened. As if sensing his understanding, the great black creature turned its head. Those intelligent, luminous eyes met his across the distance. There was no malice in only a deep, timeless watchfulness. Then, with a fluidity that defied its size, it melted backward into the fog, vanishing as completely as if it had never been. The oppressive presence was gone, replaced by the normal damp chill of the moor. The low growl from the shadows had also ceased, the lesser threat chased away by the greater. Evan hurried down into the basin. The ewe was trembling but unharmed, and beside her, nestled in the heather, was a newborn lamb, still wet and wobbly on its legs. He had not just found a lost animal, he had found new life, delivered safely under the watchful eye of the moor's ancient sentinel. He gathered the ewe and her lamb, carrying them carefully back towards the safety of the farm, the fog closing behind him like a curtain. He never spoke of what he had truly seen, not in any way that would be believed. In the village pub, when the subject of the beast arose, he would simply shake his head and say, "The moor keeps its secrets, best to leave it be." But to his grandchildren he told a different tale. He spoke of the spirit of the moor, a great shadowy guardian that was neither good nor evil, but was of the land itself. He warned them to always treat the moor with respect, to take only what they needed, to walk softly and leave no trace. The story of the beast, he knew, was not a warning about a monster, but a reminder that some places are still wild, still sacred, and are guarded by forces older than memory, forces that demand and deserve our deepest respect.